Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive into the Epstein files. Aaron Swartz was a brilliant young programmer, internet activist, and fierce advocate for open access to information who, at just 24 years old, found himself facing an aggressive federal prosecution after downloading millions of academic articles through MIT's network. 2 years later, in January of 2013, Aaron was dead at the age of 26, while the case against him had still been hanging over his head. Now, at first glance, Aaron Swartz and Jeffrey Epstein seem like two people who should have absolutely nothing to do with each other. But the deeper we look into MIT, the more their stories begin occupying the same strange network of people, money, and power. Because just months after Aaron died, MIT Media Lab director Joy Ito was privately cultivating Jeffrey Epstein as a donor, introducing him to MIT scientists and helping to conceal his involvement with the university. And then, while worrying that Epstein and Woody Allen being seen together at MIT might attract unwanted attention, Ito personally sent Epstein an article that claimed that Aaron Swartz had been investigating something far deeper at MIT than JSTOR and academic articles. So in part 2, we're going inside the media lab, the people Jeffrey Epstein was funding there, what he was funding there, and the allegations that suddenly make Aaron Swartz's story look a lot less isolated from the world of Jeffrey Epstein than it did before, or at least than it did at first glance. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm so excited. So excited because if you've seen the last video I posted on YouTube, I've made so many connections as I was putting this video together. Connections that I myself hadn't even personally linked while I was doing my initial research. And it was all kind of zipping together while I was writing the script and looking into other things. So I can't wait to share all of this with you. I'm very, very excited. Additionally, I would like to take a moment to recognize Hayden Panettiere, who passed away this week at just 36 years old. A lot of us grew up watching Hayden, whether it was Remember the Titans, Heroes, Nashville. For me, it was all of the above, and for some reason, many feel the way that I do because Hayden was special to us. She never felt polished or generic. She was without a doubt extraordinarily talented in every way, undeniably beautiful, but still so human, so vulnerable. And I think a lot of what we saw when she was in front of a camera was real and raw and came from a place of true pain and knowing and living in darkness from a very young age. And to me, her story feels connected to all of this same larger machine, a system that protects money, access, and power, while the people without those things are left carrying the damage and the trauma and the silence. They're left with their lives ruined, sometimes with their lives ending. And I'm tired of standing idly by and watching talented, brilliant people who shine so brightly get crushed under the wheels of industries and institutions that are perfectly willing to sacrifice them to protect money, to protect power, to protect reputations and secrets. And that's why we keep talking about this. Because Jeffrey Epstein in prison, not alive anymore, whatever, it doesn't mean it's over. It's far from it. For people like Aaron, for people like Hayden, we continue to talk about this. People who entered these spaces so young and ambitious and often too naive to understand just how corrupt or depraved these spaces and systems around them can be. And even when they do manage to escape, they rarely walk away unscathed. Sometimes they spend the rest of their lives carrying what happened to them, and sometimes they never really get out at all. Chester Bennington, Britney Spears, Justin Bieber, Judy Garland, the list goes on and runs parallel to the victims of people like Jeffrey Epstein, Sean Combs, R. Kelly, and all the people like them who existed inside of these predatory power circles for far too long. So we have a lot to talk about today, but before we get started, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Helix Sleep. I feel like I say this every time we talk about sleep, but the longer life goes on, the older I get, the more I realize that sleep is not something I can just casually neglect and expect there to be no consequences. There was definitely a time in my life when I could stay up until 2 a.m, get 4 hours of sleep, drink some coffee, and pretend everything was fine, but those days are gone. Now, if I don't sleep well, everybody knows about it, including me. And that's one of the reasons I really appreciate Helix, because they don't approach mattresses like there's one magical mattress that's somehow supposed to work for every single person. Helix actually has a sleep quiz that asks you questions about things like your sleep position, your body type, how firm or soft do you like your mattress, whether you sleep hot or cold, basically all of those little things that make a huge difference in whether you're actually comfortable at night. Then they use your answers to match you with a mattress designed around those preferences. And considering that Helix has more than 20 unique mattresses to choose from, as well as a variety of mattress toppers, I would personally much rather have them narrow it down for me than try to stand there looking up 20 mattresses, wondering which one's going to work, doing in-depth research on each one, making a pros cons list, and then hoping for the best. Helix has soft, medium, and firm mattresses, different options for side, stomach, or back sleepers, and their mattresses have a supportive hybrid design with premium cooling options if you sleep warm, or if you are like me and you've lived through this most current intense heat wave and you never want to suffer like this again. I have the Midnight Luxe mattress. I've had it for a long time, I think since like 2019, and I love that after sleeping on it for almost 7-8 years now, it's just as comfortable as the first day I got it. In fact, I would actually probably say it's more comfortable. I love that I don't wake up exhausted because I've been tossing and turning all night. That's what it used to be like. I'd never be able to fall into a deep sleep. I'd constantly be moving positions, try to get comfortable, but now I just find my little comfy spot, pass out, and wake up feeling rested. And I remember for the first few years of owning my Helix mattress, I knew it was the best and that it was comfortable because everyone in my house always made their way into my bed. All the dogs, all the kids posted up in my bed every Sunday for lazy mornings and movie marathons. But now every single room in my house has a Helix mattress, so we get to rotate Sunday mornings now. Helix also makes the entire process incredibly easy. Your mattress ships free in the US directly to your door, and once you get it, Helix gives you a 120-night sleep trial. That means you can bring it home, set it up, and then you actually have time to sleep on it where you're the most comfortable in your own home, and you can make sure it's right for you. Helix mattresses also come with a limited lifetime warranty. Helix has been reviewed against hundreds of competitors, and they always win. Helix has been voted USA Today's most trusted brand winner in 2026, and the Helix Midnight Luxe mattress, which is the one I have, has been ranked as the best overall mattress according to both Forbes and Wired. Because buying a mattress is one of those purchases where I do not want to realize 3 nights later that I've made a terrible mistake. I need some time to commit. I need some time to sleep in it, be lazy in it for a few hours, do my diamond paintings at midnight, and see how my back feels after that. And I don't want to go to some mattress store and land a bunch of mattresses while a salesperson looms above me. It just feels like too private and intimate of an experience to have an audience of a stranger. So Helix is the way to go for this. They have the best mattresses. They've got the best process. You don't have to go to stores, shop around. You don't have to have these weird sales pressure techniques. And if you've been thinking about upgrading your mattress, this is a really good time to do it. I've been loving the Comfort Adjust cooling pillow. It's customizable to support every sleeping position and preference. And not only does it keep you cool throughout the night with Glaciotex heat conductive fabric, but you can adjust the firmness and height to whatever feels most comfortable for you because it's made with shredded memory foam that contours to your body while still giving great support. So you can see me here. I'm taking some of the memory foam out so it makes it less firm, or you can put more in to make it more firm. All you have to do is visit helixsleep.com/Harlowe and take advantage of their Labor Day sale. Save up to 30% off on select mattresses. Once again, that's helix.com/Harlowe to save up to 30% off on select mattresses for Helix's Labor Day sale. Thank you so much to Helix for sponsoring today's video. And let's dive in. Okay, we need to start by examining how Joy Ito, director of the MIT Media Lab, for a reason nobody can figure out how he became that director. But anyways, Joy Ito, director of the MIT Media Lab, and Jeffrey Epstein, how did they meet? And how this not-so-chance meeting developed into a lucrative personal and business relationship for them both that lasted years. In fact, right up until the world heard that Jeffrey Epstein was no longer with us, allegedly. Now, what's important to know is that Joy Ito wrote more than 8,000 emails to Epstein, making him one of Epstein's most prolific correspondents. And this Epstein dude was talking to people all the time, all day, every day, talking to people, okay? Clearly, he did not have a job. And this friendship between Joy Ito and Jeffrey Epstein, it wasn't a decades-long friendship to kind of explain or justify that amount of correspondence. These two besties met in 2013, meaning they only had roughly, about 6 years to exchange all of these emails, and that doesn't account for the countless phone calls and in-person visits and what I'm sure were other conversations happening on encrypted apps, because we know Jeffrey Epstein loved to use Telegram. So Ito had been to Epstein Island, he'd been to his Manhattan townhouse, Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, and of course they saw each other multiple times during Epstein's many visits to the MIT campus and the Media Lab. In August of 2019, Joy Ito released My Apology Regarding Jeffrey Epstein on the Media Lab's website. Now, keep in mind, this was years before the Epstein files were released. We know that initial partial records of the Epstein files were made public in December of 2025, and then more happened at the beginning of 2026. But let's quickly examine what Joy Ito's apology looked like before he knew that we were going to get an inside look at all of his emails and shady business dealings with a man he knew was a convicted sex offender from the beginning. Like, Joy Ito knew that Jeffrey Epstein was at the center of this enormous scandal involving women and minor children. All right, so Joy Ito says, quote, "I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen recent news stories about Jeffrey Epstein, and I owe it to you to address my prior affiliation with him. I met Epstein at a conference through a trusted business friend, and in my fundraising efforts for MIT Media Lab, I invited him to the lab and visited several of his residences. I want you to know that in all of my interactions with Epstein, I was never involved in, never heard him talk about, and never saw any evidence of the horrific acts that he was accused of." End quote. He was accused of. He went to jail for it, Joy Ito, okay? So Joy Ito wrote this on August 15th, 5 days after Epstein died. So it was his prior affiliation that he's saying in this email or this apology, like, my prior affiliation. It's your prior affiliation because Jeffrey Epstein is dead, right? No longer in the public, no longer able for you to affiliate with, not because you ended the affiliation because of who he was or what he did. Because in February of that same year, Ito was still emailing Epstein about getting money for MIT. Now, according to Joy Ito, he first met Jeffrey Epstein in February of 2013 at a TED conference, and he was introduced to Epstein by Linda Stone. Linda Stone was a Media Lab Advisory Council member. Linda Stone and her relationship with Epstein predates this by quite a long time, predates Joy Ito and Epstein meeting, and it's also very problematic. But we have way too much to talk about in this video to even start diving into that. But no, Linda Stone, you are not safe. We'll come back to you at one point. Now, according to an MIT report, because after Epstein's affiliations with MIT and how deep they went and how long they had been going on for, and how hard people have been trying to cover them up, they had to do an investigation and then they put out a report. So according to this report from MIT, after meeting Jeffrey Epstein, Joy Ito conducted what he described as due diligence. He Googled Epstein and spoke with certain people to learn more about Epstein. And he said that these people were members of the Media Lab Advisory Council, tech billionaires, a Harvard Law School professor, and Nicholas Negroponte, the creator of the Media Lab, who we are going to talk more about in a bit. Trust. We're going to talk about Nick Negroponte. So by March 28th, Joy Ito was telling Nicholas Negroponte that Epstein had a tainted past. But he also said that Linda Stone had assured him that Epstein was awesome. And Negroponte told Joy Ito, "Listen, this is no problem. I know Epstein well. I see no reason to not take his money," right? This is what Nicholas Negroponte is saying to Joy Ito. Actually, to be more exact, Negroponte said, quote, "I know him quite well. The person who is his closest friend is Marvin Minsky, who even visited him in jail. I would take Berlusconi's money, so why not Jeff?" End quote. Now, this reference, Berlusconi, is to the former prime minister of Italy, who at that time had been accused of hiring underage girls for sex and then also dating underage girls. Okay. So Nicholas Negroponte is like, who cares? They all suck. Take their money. But also understand it wasn't Nicholas Negroponte being like, yeah, whatever, these guys suck. We might as well take their money, like, and help make MIT better. He was close with Jeffrey Epstein. As he self-admitted, I'm close to him. I know the guy. He's all over Jeffrey Epstein's emails. So it wasn't just like, oh, it's professional. It's not personal. Like, just take the money because we can help. If we use his money, we can help MIT and all the research we're going to do here. No, it was like, yeah, take his money. I'm friends with him. I vouch for him. By May of 2013, Jeffrey Epstein had sent the MIT Media Lab an unrestricted gift. Okay, so this was a unrestricted gift for $100,000 that went into Joy Ito's discretionary account. So that basically means that it's $100,000 that's unrestricted. It doesn't need to be placed anywhere specific. Joy Ito can decide what he wants to do with it. It can go anywhere. And this is a sum of money that Joy Ito described internally at MIT as money to get started. And then Ito also wondered if he could persuade Epstein to financially support the Media Lab more substantially. He even said, like, hey, I wonder, if this unsolicited $100,000 check means we can get some real money from Jeffrey Epstein, because $100,000 is not real money. Now, by June of 2013, Joy Ito was emailing Linda Stone, thanking her for the introduction to Jeffrey Epstein, right? So we go from very quickly Joy Ito going to Nicholas Negroponte and being like, I got some reservations about this guy, to within like a month or so, he's like, thank you so much, Linda Stone, for bringing Jeffrey Epstein into my life. Joy Ito told Linda Stone, quote, "I really enjoyed our conversation last time at his place. It was nearly 5 hours. He's invited me to the island, which I'm thinking of doing in July, and I'm planning on giving him a tour of Kyoto later in the year. He sent an unsolicited $100,000 check to MIT, which triggered a request for more information from MIT. As my advisor about these things, what do you think the risks are? I think MIT may get antsy about his background. Not sure. Nicholas and I talked about figuring out if he decides that if he wants to give real money. I personally feel like I want to just get to know him, and if I trust him and I like him, I'll hang out with him and work with him and trust my own judgment. Any thoughts on what sort of public perception issues there are and how other people deal with it? People in my office are a bit weirded out, as you can imagine." End quote. Yes. People at the MIT Media Lab were indeed weirded out, meaning they'd been telling Joy Ito, hey, this Jeffrey Epstein guy might not be someone the Media Lab should work with or be affiliated with, right? He's got some, bad stuff in his life. He's got a reputation, and it's not good, and we shouldn't be involved in it. And in June, when a staff member raised concerns again, Joy Ito defended Jeffrey Epstein, saying, quote, "I find him very smart and interesting and excited about our work," end quote. The following month, another Media Lab staff member said something about Epstein, and Joy Ito asked her to keep an open mind and wrote in an email, quote, "I talked to him for about 30 hours already, so I don't know him, but I've learned a lot about how he thinks, and I've learned a lot about how the world works, and I just wanted to share it with you." End quote. What does he mean? I learned a lot about how the world works. Does he mean that he learned a lot about how the world works from talking to Epstein? Yes. But also from talking to other people about like, hey, how can we take Jeffrey Epstein's money and not make it look bad for us? And Joy Ito means like, I've learned a lot about how the world works and how like, hey, yeah, if people don't publicly want something to be known because it might make your industry or your institution as a whole look bad, like you're taking dirty money from a predator, There's ways you can get around it. I've learned how the world works. So Joy Ito brought Epstein to the MIT campus for the first time on June 28th, 2013, and he introduced him to a bunch of people: neurotechnology professors Ed Boyden and Neil Gershenfeld. Epstein was treated to an intimate tour of Boyden's synthetic neurobiology lab, where they discussed his pioneering work in optogenetics, and they hung out with Gershenfeld, who was the director of MIT's Center for Bits and Atoms. Epstein would be at MIT and the Media Lab several more times, and we'll touch on that, but MIT has publicly acknowledged that after Epstein's conviction in August of 2012, he donated $750,000 to Joy Ito and to the Media Lab. And MIT's own report acknowledges that members of their senior team were aware of and approved his donations. The report says, quote, "These members of the senior team who approved MIT's acceptance of Epstein's donations were aware that Epstein had a criminal record involving sex offenses," end quote. Let's just take a moment here and remember how hard MIT went after Aaron Swartz, how much they cooperated with law enforcement and the federal government to make sure that this kid's life was destroyed. And they'll say they didn't cooperate, but once again, we know what they did behind the scenes. They'll say, oh, we were told to do this. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to do all that you did to provide all of this information to the federal government so that the federal government could go ahead and bully and pressure Aaron into submission and destroy his entire life and end up with his life being gone, whether he did it himself or somebody else did it to him. We will discuss that, but it doesn't even really matter because, in my opinion, and in the opinions of many other people, obviously, if Aaron Swartz hadn't been the target of a federal government harassment, he'd still be alive today. And this is also an agreed upon opinion by Aaron Swartz's own father, who said, "The government killed my son." What did he mean by that? Well, we'll talk about that. But also remember, Aaron Swartz's father was not necessarily working, but was a contractor for the MIT Media Lab. So at this point, MIT is admitting, yes, our senior officials who approved Epstein to donate all this money to MIT, they were aware of his criminal record. They knew what his reputation was. And so MIT decided that being publicly associated with Jeffrey Epstein's money was dangerous enough that his name needed to be kept out of view. They knew how bad he was, and they knew that if other people knew that MIT was getting money from him, they might have a problem with that. So instead of being honest or just not doing it, they hid it. They lied. They didn't conclude that the danger of being associated with Jeffrey Epstein meant that they should refuse his money. So basically, they decided that it would be fine as long as the donations were in smaller amounts and were made anonymously. But wait, there's more, because on top of the $750,000 that Epstein donated anonymously to MIT, he convinced and arranged for donations to the university from other wealthy individuals. In 2014, Bill Gates made a $2 million donation to the Media Lab, and that same year, Leon Black made a $5 million donation. Now, obviously, Bill Gates, Leon Black, I don't think he cares. I don't think he's talked publicly about it. But Bill Gates has tried and failed for years to distance himself from Epstein and to minimize the relationship that they had and how much they communicated and how ingrained in each other's lives they were. So in the wake of that information getting out, the $2 million from Bill Gates to MIT on behalf of Epstein, a representative for Bill Gates told MIT that Epstein had nothing to do with the donation, nothing to do with it. That was Bill Gates doing it out of the goodness of his heart because he loves education and research. A public statement was issued stating the same thing. Bill Gates donated to MIT, had nothing to do with Epstein. However, once again, you can't believe anything these people say. You can't. No matter how hard Bill Gates has tried to distance himself from Jeffrey Epstein and convince the world that he barely knew the guy, the fact on record shows something totally contrary. In an October 16, 2014 email exchange between Jeffrey Epstein and Joy Ito, Epstein talked about setting up a gift for the Media Lab and then said, quote, "This is separate $2 million from Gates," end quote. He's saying this is separate from the $2 million that I already convinced Bill Gates to give, which In my opinion, and I have to wonder, was that Bill Gates' money, or did Jeffrey Epstein give Bill Gates $2 million so that Bill Gates could donate it to MIT under his name, but everyone at MIT knew it was coming from Jeffrey Epstein? Now, you might also say, we can't believe Jeffrey Epstein. He's always lying. He could be lying in this email and saying like, oh yeah, I made Bill Gates give you that money. He could just be lying and trying to take credit. And to that point, I would point you to an internal MIT email in regards to the $2 million donation. The email is from Joy Ito to Peter Cohen, Director of Development and Strategy at the MIT Media Lab. And it says, quote, "This is a $2 million gift from Bill Gates, directed by Jeffrey Epstein," end quote. So Cohen replied, quote, "For gift recording purposes, we will not be mentioning Jeffrey's name as the impetus for this gift," end quote, saying like, hey, for, keeping it all under wraps, keeping it all hidden, we're not going to say Jeffrey Epstein had anything to do with this. And then a mandatory record of that donation from Bill Gates filed within the university stated that Bill Gates, quote, "is making this gift at the recommendation of a friend of his who wishes to remain anonymous," end quote. So explain that, Bill Gates. Explain that. If you said, no, this is just my donation, why does the record say that you made the donation on behalf or at the encouragement of a friend who wishes to remain anonymous? Who is that friend, if not Jeffrey Epstein? So on top of making sure any money that had anything to do with Epstein was kept real hush-hush, the MIT Media Lab actively worked to conceal their connection or relationship with Epstein. In Joy Ito's calendar for MIT, which always listed full names for appointments, Epstein was never listed as his full name, only by his initials, J.E. And people working at the Media Lab referred to him as Voldemort, or he who shall not be named. And I just want to touch on this briefly because you might say that Joy Ito was just wooing Epstein for his money, trying to help the Media Lab, and to some extent, yes, I guess that's what he was doing, but he was also personally financially tied to Epstein outside of MIT, as was another familiar name, right? Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn and one of the first financial backers of OpenAI. Reid Hoffman is all over the Epstein files. So when he first met Epstein, Joy Ito was already a venture capitalist and a startup investor. Reid Hoffman was one of Silicon Valley's most prominent investors. MIT's own investigation found that Epstein put $1 million into a $9 million private investment fund managed by Joy Ito, plus another $250,000 into a company created to commercialize technology developed at MIT. Now, here's another thing. In the spring of 2014, Joy Ito, Epstein, and Reid Hoffman were working together on a private investment in something called Smart Things. And they did this by using a special purpose vehicle. Okay, an SPV. I didn't know what that was, but I've been learning a lot. So an SPV is basically a separate sort of one-off LLC, and it allowed Hoffman and Epstein and Joy Ito to pool their money together and invest in something as a single entity, right? So if you don't want Epstein's name on it, if you don't want Joy Ito's name on it, if you don't want Reid Hoffman's name on it, if you don't want anybody to know that you are investing in something with other people for whatever reason, you don't want them to know that, you would create an LLC. Like for this trio, it might be something like Egomaniacs LLC, right? And then Egomaniacs LLC takes the money and holds it from all three people who are investing into this vehicle, this LLC. And then that LLC invests in some startup or technology or whatever. So the released emails show that Joy Ito was handling the mechanics of putting the investment vehicle together, setting up the LLC. The group discussed paperwork and how to structure it. They went back and forth on like what they should name it. They came up with a bunch of things. They were having a lot of fun in the emails. Like, we should call it this. We should call it this. Like, we should call it deception because that's funny. Yeah, that's too on the nose, I think. So Smart Things which is what their special vehicle thing actually ended up investing in, it was a really good, lucky investment, okay? Because at the time, SmartThings was an early Internet of Things kind of smart home platform, a hub and software platform that lets things like locks, lights, sensors, thermostats, and appliances communicate and be controlled from a phone, kind of like the world we live in now, but this was in 2014. And Samsung actually acquired SmartThings on August 14th, 2014, only a few months after the Ito, Epstein, Reid Hoffman investment. Samsung bought SmartThings for $200 million. And now that same software, the SmartThings software, is integrated into billions of Samsung devices, including Galaxy smartphones, tablets, smart TVs, home appliances, etc. So if you're holding a Samsung phone in your hand as we speak, or watching me on a Samsung TV, just know Jeffrey Epstein helped get you here. Thank you. He did. It's ridiculous. And he probably made a lot of money off of that lucky investment that went through just a few months before this big company, Samsung, purchased this SmartThings technology, which, once again, this is insider trading, okay? This is insider trading. But I'm going to explain this later, because was Samsung a part of the Media Lab? We're going to talk about that. Was Samsung a part of the MIT Media Lab? Were they paying the Media Lab to develop things for them? And did Joy Ito know that? And did Joy Ito personally invest his personal money into a technology that he knew was possibly going to be purchased by Samsung because he had a close working relationship with Samsung because the Media Lab did? I don't know. But okay. That's all I'm saying. It's just allegedly, this sounds like insider trading. So Jeffrey Epstein is giving so much money to MIT Media Lab. And that sounds bad, but you need to know and understand more to feel the full impact of how bad it was. It wasn't just a financial transaction. And to understand that, we need to talk about Nicholas Negroponte and the rise of the MIT Media Lab. Unfortunately, I have had to watch like 20 interviews with Nicholas Negroponte, and I can tell you that he is really, really impressed with himself. I can tell you that, in my opinion, he has very few morals when it comes to what he wants to achieve, what he wants people to think about him. And I can tell you that he has roughly 3 different stories that he circulates and uses in almost every interview I've seen with him. So Nicholas Negroponte was born in New York City in December of 1943 into a wealthy Greek shipping family. His father, Dmitri, was a shipping magnate. His mother, Catherine, was from a prominent Greek shipping family. And his older brother, John Negroponte, went on to have a major U.S. diplomatic and national security career. And we need to talk about John. This is Nicholas Negroponte, the founder of the Media Lab at MIT. This is his older brother. So John Negroponte was born in London in 1939. He attended Yale, and right out of college, he joined the United States Foreign Service in 1960. And as a young diplomat, he served in Saigon, he learned Vietnamese, and became deeply involved in U.S. policy towards the war. By the late 1960s, he had advanced far enough that he was involved with the Paris peace negotiations, including secret sessions with the North Vietnamese. There are actual State Department records showing John Negroponte sitting in meetings alongside Henry Kissinger and other central players in those negotiations. Now, understand that Henry Kissinger, we've talked about him a little bit before in past Epstein episodes, but he was pretty much known as someone who was brutal when it came to like foreign policy. He was willing to support policies that caused enormous human suffering if he believed that they advanced strategic goals for the United States. So in Vietnam, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon dramatically escalated bombing and like pressure techniques. Kissinger was all about using military force as leverage to get what he wanted and what the U.S. wanted from these other countries. But John Negroponte butted heads with Kissinger. And when I say he butted heads with Kissinger, he thought Kissinger was like not brutal enough. He accused Kissinger of making too many concessions to North Vietnam. John Negroponte thought that Henry Kissinger was being too soft, and he felt that they should go harder, even though they were already going, objectively, pretty hard. They were going pretty hard. So then in 1981, Ronald Reagan appointed John Negroponte as U.S. ambassador to Honduras. And this is where it becomes interesting because at that time, Honduras was becoming one of the most strategically important pieces on the chessboard of Reagan's war against communism in Central America. So remember in the Zorro Ranch Epstein videos, we talked about Robert Maxwell and his publishing companies and the Promise software and arms dealing, Central American drug trafficking, the Mena, Arkansas connection, the Boys on the Tracks connection, and how this all tied together into the Epstein universe with the CIA and the intelligence communities and the scientific communities. Well, here we are again, because at this time, the Reagan administration was determined to weaken and probably overthrow the Sandinista government right next door to Honduras in Nicaragua. And this is when the CIA started backing the Contras, right? And this is historically all, out there. You should know about this. If you don't, learn about it. But the Contras were the armed rebels who were fighting the Sandinistas. And the CIA was the one who wanted the Sandinistas out of Nicaragua, right? Just as the same as they kind of wanted Fidel Castro out of Cuba. And so they created an army of Cuban rebels to try to kill Castro and overthrow Castro's government. They did the same thing here in Honduras. They got the Contras together, they trained them, they armed them, they funded them. And then Honduras, right? That basically became the launching pad of the Contra army that the CIA was building and training, with John Negroponte sitting right in the center of it. During his time as the ambassador there, U.S. military aid to Honduras exploded, right? Just all of a sudden, we're tons of money going there. And then American military exercises also expanded and were more frequent. Contra forces operated from Honduran territory. CIA activities increased dramatically because the CIA is training and funding and arming the Contras. John Negroponte communicated regularly with Honduran military leaders and with Washington about this covert CIA war against Nicaragua and the Sandinistas. So declassified cables show he even pressed the State Department to be more careful about openly referring to U.S. support for Contra forces operating from Honduras. He didn't want people to know that because initially the public U.S. position that was kind of the government was putting out to the world, where it was we need to overthrow the Sandinistas. They're bad and they're harmful, right? So we're going to help the Contras. They didn't say we put the Contras together and we're funding them and we're training them, but they're we're going to help them and make sure they have enough money and they can fight this war, to make things better in their little area of the world. That was kind of the initial public perception and what was being put forward to the American taxpayers who were funding all of this. But then public opinion started to turn against that, and people were we really don't our taxpayer money funding this kind of thing. It feels weird, and the Contras are doing really bad things. And we're hearing about these human rights violations, and we don't really like that. So John Negroponte told Washington, he was let's just chill with the being honest with the American people thing. I don't think that's the best method of doing things right now. And if that wasn't bad enough, Honduran military intelligence operated a notorious unit eventually known as Battalion 316, and members of that unit did all sorts of atrocities, right? They abducted political opponents and suspected communists. They tortured them. In a lot of cases, they murdered them or disappeared them. So the unit and the related Honduran intelligence services had relationships with U.S. intelligence. They received training and assistance and money connected to the United States and Argentina. The existence and abuses of what these Honduran security units were doing, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's fact. Once again, you can look it up. They were doing horrible, horrible things to people, and they became the subject of substantial later documentation, declassification, people finally saying, how did this happen? Why did we let this happen? And all of this was happening while John Negroponte was the American ambassador to Honduras. Now, John Negroponte's position, what he says, it's always consistently been that he did not know the full scope of the abuses at the time, and that when these credible human rights concerns were raised, he talked about them privately with the Honduran officials. However, declassified State Department material indicates that, surprise, surprise, that's probably not true. He knew a lot, in my opinion, and also, like I keep saying in my opinion, because I don't want John Negroponte to sue me, but honestly, like, yeah, he knew almost everything, I would say, all right? Just allegedly, in my opinion, just in case, because I don't know what Jen Negroponte's up to right now. So Senator Christopher Dodd, after reviewing State Department and CIA records, said that Negroponte knew considerably more about Honduran abuses than he disclosed publicly or in State Department human rights reporting. He said that Negroponte knew serious abuses were occurring, he minimized them publicly, and continued supporting the Honduran military because it was strategically indispensable to the United States and Ronald Reagan's Central American policy, right? The ends justifies the means kind of thing. Because without Honduras, the Contra operation would become much harder, right? How could they do all this stuff with the Contras and send them over next door to Nicaragua to overthrow the Sandinistas if you didn't have cooperation from the Honduran government and if you didn't have cooperation from the Honduran military? And so, yeah, maybe it was like John Negroponte being like, I'll look the other way. You guys do what you have to do so you continue working with us and letting us train the Contras over here. But he knew, okay? He knew. So declassified records show an extremely hands-on ambassador in John Negroponte. He was deeply engaged in the Contra operation. He corresponded with CIA Director William Casey about it. He helped shape a secret presidential intelligence finding concerning support for the Contras. He met repeatedly with Honduran military officials. And when State Department cables openly referred to the United States backing the Contras, Negroponte complained that they needed to be more discreet about putting that information in ordinary communications. He's like, listen, guys, let's not just talk openly about the truth. That's a problem. Once again, this is not how we should be operating. Now, all of this places John Negroponte extremely close to the machinery that later erupted publicly as Iran-Contra. Now let's bring our attention back to Jeffrey Epstein, and I need to pull some threads from a previous video I did on Epstein and Robert Maxwell and the Maxwell's family's ties to the government and the CIA. If you watched that video, this will hopefully just clarify things even further. If you didn't, I'll try to sum everything up without being redundant, but just go watch the video or trust me. Remember, Iran-Contra was the major scandal during the Reagan administration where the U.S. secretly sold arms to Iran and then used some of the money they got from those sales to fund the Contra rebels in an attempt to overthrow the Sandinista-controlled Nicaragua. So once public opinion turned against helping the Contras, the United States was like, well, we have to find a way to still give them money and help them without, everyone figuring it out. So we'll sell weapons to Iran and then we'll take that money and then use it to fund the Contras. Now, the Contra support operation that we're talking about here, that required obviously an enormous and secret logistics network. All interconnected pieces, like an octopus, you might say. And that's a reference to the previous video we did about Robert Maxwell and all of this stuff. So they would need things like airplanes, pilots, remote airstrips, warehouses, money, banking institutions, shell companies, etc. Right? The Justice Department's own later review showed that there was substantial evidence that people associated with Contra organizations were also involved with drug traffickers, like allegations that the airfields used for Contra resupply were at the same time being used by cocaine traffickers. Barry Seal, one of the most prolific cocaine smugglers operating in the United States at this time, was moving enormous quantities of cocaine for the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar, and one of the places associated with his aviation operation was Mena, Arkansas, right? We've talked about this. This goes back to the boys on the tracks. Those little boys, I guess they weren't little boys, they were like young teenagers, but those boys that were just shot execution style and killed on the train tracks in Mena, Arkansas, because they saw something they shouldn't have seen. And then they were left on those tracks to be run over and have the evidence destroyed. And this is, once again, in my opinion, the boys on the tracks, the deaths of these innocent kids was a government cover-up, okay? I will link the Boys on the Track series if you haven't seen it. You should watch it. But a Senate investigation looking deeply into Contra-related narcotics activity found that associates of Barry Seal, who operated aviation businesses in Mena, Arkansas, were also subjects of grand jury narcotics investigations, and potential money laundering prosecutions were not pursued against them, even though the local investigators wanted them to be. And we know there was a CIA presence at Mena, Arkansas, at their Intermountain Airport, where Barry Seal had aircraft operations and where the CIA has admitted to conducting some aviation-related activities, which is vague, but it means they were there. The CIA was there. They were aware of it. They were present there in Mena, Arkansas, and they had some motive to be there and be interested in it, which leads people to believe that CIA operations interfered with normal narcotics investigations. Right? Like, as in, hey, these people connected to Barry Seal, connected to Mena, connected to drug trafficking, they are wanting to be prosecuted in their local areas. And then all of a sudden they're not being prosecuted because, like, is the government coming in, the CIA at least, and being like, hey, they're integral to like us selling guns to Iran and then sending that money to the Contras. So we need you guys to chill, right? Because we need these people to be flying the guns and the money back and forth. And like, yeah, they're also bringing drugs into the country, like a lot of them, but it's, well, the ends justifies the means once again, right? And eventually Barry Seal was caught. And we know that he was caught, but we also know he didn't go to prison. He began cooperating with federal authorities, particularly the DEA, and he became a government informant. So this is what I'm saying. These people get caught doing this, and then the government's like, keep doing this, right? Keep going and getting the drugs. But also, we need your help with this. We need your help with the Iran thing, okay? And then during an undercover operation in 1984, Barry Seal flew to Nicaragua and participated in a cocaine transportation that U.S. authorities secretly photographed. Okay? He knew they were photographing it. And the people in these pictures were people connected to the Sandinista government, which then gave the Reagan administration a public argument for why the Sandinista government was dangerous and why the U.S. needed to support the Contras and like down with the Sandinistas because they're drug traffickers, right? But we also know that drug traffickers helped with the Iran-Contra operations. We know the government knew this was happening, and it seemed they helped save certain people connected to their covert operations from prosecution. Or at least took those people and said, hey, you got caught for all this drug trafficking, right? You're flying a bunch of cocaine in from your friend Pablo, and you're bringing it to the United States. Now, we can either put you in prison forever, or you can keep doing what you're doing for them and also do this for us, right? So, because we need planes, we need pilots, we need people who know how to fly things they're not supposed to be flying around the country, around the world. We need that. So do it for us, and then, yeah, keep doing it for them, right? And this is a pattern, and which is exactly what I believe happened with Jeffrey Epstein when he finally got caught for his human trafficking, right? When he finally got caught for his human trafficking, there was not a, you're going behind bars forever. There was a, we're going to protect you. We're going to protect all the people you've given us a list that we should protect. And why? Why? Because was he already working for some sort of intelligence agency? Yes, he was. Yes, he was. But that's not where his connections end, because Jeffrey Epstein was directly involved with the Iran-Contra operation. As a quick callback to the Zorro Ranch episode where we talked about Robert Maxwell and the sale and distribution of a software that was very similar to another software, Promise, that had been contracted by the U.S. government, and then they were accused of stealing it by the person who made the software, a software that the FBI back in the 80s believed was being installed at scientific labs in New Mexico. So think of Iran-Contra as the operational scandal, while Promise, the software, potentially is going to represent the information intelligence side of that same clandestine work. And when Danny Casolaro was researching the alleged government theft of Promise, he found all this other stuff. That's what he called the octopus. And he reached the conclusion that the same individuals and operations and structures surrounding Promise had resurfaced in Iran-Contra, the BCCI drug trafficking. BCCI is the bank, the financial institution. Because remember, you need all of these things to do Iran-Contra and to do all this other stuff. You need the pilots and you need the banks and you need the shell corporations. And then all these other covert operations that were all tied together. Congress did find that a version of Promise had been distributed to entities, including Israel, and they heard sworn allegations that Reagan-connected officials secretly transferred the enhanced software to a guy named Earl Bryan for intelligence use. Congress didn't necessarily prove this allegation, like they heard testimony from enough people and the stories all lined up, but concluded that the evidence they had found and the testimony they had heard were serious enough to warrant a further investigation. So what happened when Congress said, yeah, we need to investigate this further, right? There's something weird going on here with the CIA and Iran-Contra and drug trafficking and this Promise software and these financial institutions that are somehow wrapped up in this drug trafficking. So Earl Bryan, who the Congress, found out that a copy of Promise had been given to him. He was a California businessman and political ally of Ronald Reagan, who had served in Reagan's California administration, including as Secretary of Health and Welfare when Reagan was governor of California. And this guy, Earl Bryan, he later became a defense technology executive for Hadron Inc., which was a government consulting contractor that worked for federal agencies. Israel was an important intermediary in the early Iran-Contra arms transfer to Iran, while around the same period there were allegations that the Department of Justice software, the Promise software that they had bought, had also been transferred to Israel for intelligence use. Congress confirmed. Like I said, they confirmed that a version of Promise did go to Israel, and they said the broader allegations needed further investigation. And then a later Department of Justice review rejected that claim. They were like, no, we hear you. You're saying there's enough evidence to look into this, but there's not. So we're not going to do an investigation, right? We're not. So why does Congress keep saying, hey, there's something here? And then the DOJ is like, no, we looked into it. There's nothing there. That's because Congress is, the oversight. They have the job of oversight. But the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is inside the executive branch, meaning the president and the agencies that answer to the president, like the DOJ, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, the Department of Defense, etc. So, of course, every time Congress is like, hey, we're digging into documents and testimony and evidence about something that one of those entities did wrong, the president or the CIA or the FBI or the DOJ is going to come back and say, no, we don't believe you have sufficient evidence and we don't think there's anything here to prosecute. You're asking the DOJ to investigate itself. It's like a pretend system of checks and balances that makes us feel like something is happening, but it's not. It's all a performance. It's a performance for us, right? Congress is like, we're mad. Look into this. And then the DOJ and all of these, agencies that go under the DOJ, they're like, yeah, sure, Jan, we will. Now, prominent journalist Seymour Hersh alleged that Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, had ties to Israeli intelligence and that Robert Maxwell's associate, Nicholas Davies, was involved in Israeli arm deals with Iran. And that matters because Israel's existing covert arms channels to Iran later became part of the infrastructure used in Iran-Contra. While Robert Maxwell, was also being accused of distributing Promise, software. I hope you remember, if you didn't see, the Promise software is like basically Pegasus. It's what goes into a computer, and then it keeps track of everything that's happening in the computer. So emails being sent to the computer, research in the computer. And this software was being distributed to our most sensitive nuclear scientific labs in New Mexico by Robert Maxwell. And then Robert Maxwell is also helping to distribute Promise to Israeli intelligence, or on behalf of them. And then suddenly Robert Maxwell shows up in the Albuquerque, New Mexico FBI investigations about Promise and Sandia National Labs, and a document preserved in the CIA files discusses the allegations by the maker of Promise, like the person who created the software, that Robert Maxwell was allowed to sell 2 copies of Promise back into the U.S. to Sandia and Los Alamos. So Robert Maxwell delivers the software somehow through intermediaries to Israel. Israel then gives it back to Robert Maxwell and says, okay, now that we have it and we've done what we need to do to it, put it into these 2 labs. When I say sell back, I mean after the software had been handed over to Israel, it was then given to these labs, and it was supposed to be this helpful software that would make kind of aggregating data easier, but it was really just spyware. It was spyware. So that's a lot, I know, and I'm sorry. But we're not done, because we then have the BCCI banking scandal, which involved handling the finances for the same corrupt people and corporations involved in the promise theft, involved in drug smuggling, and involved in Iran, Contra. Like, all of these same people are involved in all of these things. The octopus, as Danny Casolaro called it. The many-armed infrastructure of illegal and covert intelligence activity, so that the government can move pieces on the world stage like a chessboard and work with unsavory people to do it, but they don't want us to know about that because our tax dollars fund it. So they lie to us about it. They arrange a crisis in this country. They arrange a crisis in this country to justify our occupation and our involvement in these countries. And then they tell us that certain entities in certain countries are drug smugglers working for the cartel. And it's only later that we find out that U.S. entities are also drug smugglers working with the cartel, allowing illicit substances like cocaine to flow into this country and hurt and kill people here, all because the ends justifies the means, but not our end, not in our interests, right? Not in the normal people's best interest, in some weird geopolitical game that we have nothing to do with and never benefit from. That's the end that's being justified, or the means that's being justified. The people who do benefit from it, though, they line their pockets and then protect other people who are once again actively committing crimes and hurting others, because they need to protect those bad people's secrets in order to protect their investments and their own secrets. And Jeffrey Epstein, in my, at this point, educated opinion, was one of those people protected because he was heavily involved in all of these things. And so it was an easy choice for the government to let him off with a slap on the wrist for horrible atrocities, because he was not only helping them, but he was deeply connected to others who were and still are wealthy and in power. So in February of 2026, Congresswoman Nancy Mace sent a letter to CIA Director John Ratcliffe. And this letter requested the CIA to disclose any records they had on Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And this was after the CIA refused to confirm or deny whether such records even existed, right? They said that information was classified. So the CIA is asked, do you have any information about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell? And the CIA was like, we cannot confirm or deny whether those records exist. Telling you whether or not the records exist is classified information. So Congresswoman Mace wrote, quote, Epstein's potential ties to the CIA and its operations raise serious questions which require serious answers. The survivors of Epstein's heinous crimes and the American people deserve complete transparency on whether the CIA had any affiliation with child sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein or knew about his nefarious actions, end quote. This was in February of 2026. I have been saying from the beginning that Epstein was not just your normal, independently working bad guy, that he was connected to an intelligence agency, I think multiple, more than one, and he's being protected and was protected by the government. I've been saying that forever, and it's absolutely true. So Nancy Mace's letter helpfully lists what Epstein's suspected CIA connections are. We have Kathy Rumler, right? We remember Kathy, the lawyer who helped Epstein help the Rothschild family make a deal with the government when they were caught hiding money for wealthy people. That we have a video on that as well. I'll link all of these. There's a playlist if you haven't seen these videos. We also have this particular statement, quote, Epstein had business ties to individuals involved in the CIA's Iran-Contra scandal. One of Epstein's first clients was Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi arms dealer who was the central middleman in the CIA's Iran-Contra operation. Epstein oversaw the repurposing of CIA front/contractor Southern Air Transport for Leslie Wexner, end quote. Leslie Wexner, Jeffrey Epstein, what's happening here? I'm going to explain, and this is all proven and backed up. Southern Air Transport was the CIA-owned airline that flew the Iran-Contra arms, right? Because remember, the CIA, they need this network, pilots and airfields and planes and all of this stuff and money and banks and all of that stuff to get the arms from one place to the other, right? And to get the money from one place to the other. And these same planes and airfields and pilots were the same ones flying drugs for cartels. So in the 1990s, Southern Air Transport was relocated from Miami to Columbus, Ohio, right? Leslie Wexner's stomping grounds. Ohio plays a big role in all of this, right? A big role in a lot of things. There's stuff going on in Ohio. And Jeffrey Epstein played a pivotal role in that relocation for Leslie Wexner, according to investigators from the Franklin County Sheriff's Office and according to the Ohio Inspector General. Once the planes were brought from Miami to Ohio, the planes were repurposed, right? The same aircraft involved in Iran-Contra and probably drug trafficking were now flying clothing shipments for Les Wexner's retail empire, including Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, The Limited. Same planes, same pilots, different cover. The CIA's Iran-Contra airline became a Wexner cargo operation with Epstein as the middleman. How did he even have access to the Southern Air Transport? How would he even know about it? Because he was involved. And this is how he hides the evidence. And this is how he helps out his friend Leslie Wexner and also hides the evidence. And also maybe is using those planes with Leslie Wexner for other things that they shouldn't be used for. So when the CIA Inspector General was about to release findings linking Southern Air Transport to Contra cocaine trafficking, because remember, it wasn't just guns. Okay, I had to stop for a moment and think about how I could say this without saying something that would get me in trouble. There is substantial evidence that the same people involved with the arms dealing for Iran-Contra were also involved in narcotics trafficking. And there is substantial evidence that the money, the proceeds from both the arms and the narcotics were used to fund the Contras. Okay? That's what I'm going to say. That's what I'm going to say, and that's what I mean. So once the CIA Inspector General had findings that linked Southern Air Transport to this cocaine trafficking, the airline declared bankruptcy exactly 1 week before the report dropped, right? So there's somebody in the government, in the CIA, who's like, hey, this report's about to drop. And lets Leslie Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein know your planes that you're using have been linked to these illicit activities from this huge scandal from the United States, Iran-Contra. Just a heads up. And then suddenly the airline goes bankrupt, right? And it's out of business. The Ohio investigation into the whole Southern Air Transport thing was killed under pressure from the governor's office. Epstein's role was never made public at the time. There's a lot more to this. And if you want to know more, then I'll go there with you eventually, but we have to move on for now. So Nancy Mace also points out that Epstein worked for Douglas Lease, an arms dealer who introduced him to Adnan Khashoggi. And then we have this quote, Epstein held ties with the co-founder and owner of the United States defense contractor DynCorp and appears to have been an intermediary to Norin Co., the Chinese state-owned defense company, end quote. Okay. There's two things here. There's two branches, and they're both very important. Epstein had ties to Steven Feinberg, co-founder of Cerebus Capital Management, which owned major U.S. military contractor DynCorp. DynCorp was one of the major American private military government contractors. It performed work for the State Department, Pentagon, and other agencies involved in things like military training, aviation, police training, security operations in places including Afghanistan, Iraq, Colombia, and Liberia. So just like we talked about in previous videos, and this goes back to our Missing Scientist series, when we talked about Amy Eskridge, we talked about the company Blackwater being a government contractor, essentially a privately owned, government-funded mercenary army unleashed on foreign land. And these companies, BlackCorp, we talked about, did horrible things, committed atrocities. DynCorp was exactly the same. It carried out armed and war-adjacent government work overseas. And get this, there are allegations that employees of DynCorp, while working on a U.S.-funded UN peacekeeping mission in Bosnia after the Yugoslav wars, were openly engaged in buying women and minor girls who had been forced into sex work. I don't like to call it sex work when you're being forced into it. We'll call it prostitution for that. Forced into prostitution, so not of their free will. The timeline is roughly 1998 to 2002. Catherine Bolkovic, a Nebraska police officer, went to Bosnia in 1999 after being hired through DynCorp to serve with the UN International Police Task Force, and her job eventually involved investigating violence against women, and she began encountering evidence that the very international personnel who were supposed to be helping stabilize Bosnia, helping the people of Bosnia, they were actually regularly visiting brothels that contained trafficked women and girls. Human Rights Watch later documented that trafficking victims in Bosnia included girls as young as 13. There was also another DynCorp whistleblower named Ben Johnston, and his testimony is especially disturbing. Johnston had worked for DynCorp doing aircraft maintenance in Bosnia. At the 2002 congressional hearing, he testified that his coworkers at DynCorp openly talked about extremely young girls. He also testified that some DynCorp employees had these young girls living with them, and that some employees appeared to regard buying or keeping these women and girls as normal and acceptable behavior. He said he repeatedly reported what he was seeing to his supervisors and U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command, and that rather than the problem being aggressively addressed, he was fired after reporting it. And Catherine Bolkovac had a similar experience. She says that when she began reporting the trafficking problem and the conduct of the DynCorp people, she was demoted and ultimately terminated. Now, DynCorp claims she was fired for falsifying timesheets. She sued them. Good for her. And in August of 2002, a British employment tribunal ruled in her favor, rejecting DynCorp's stated explanation for firing her. Later that year, she was awarded roughly £110,000. So clearly DynCorp didn't fire her for the right reason. They fired her because she was trying to report its employees for what they were doing to these young women and young girls in Bosnia. And, that's clearly what happened here. They paid her off, whatever. So for purposes of factual reporting, this whole scandal unfolded around 1999, and then the congressional hearing into it happened in 2002. Cerebus did not buy DynCorp until 2010, but I want to also state that publicly available information about sales and involvement are not always the most accurate record of what actually happened behind the scenes. And also, why the hell would you buy DynCorp after knowing what they were accused of and what they participated in and what they tried to cover up? But in the Epstein files, Steven Feinberg, who is the owner of Cerebus and now DynCorp, or was DynCorp. I think DynCorp is out of commission now. He's mentioned by name in at least 20 documents, while his firm, Cerebus, appears in 360 files. The files also contain correspondence from Deutsche Bank, Epstein's longtime financial institution, where compliance staff conducted reviews of Cerebus and Steven Feinberg's accounts, which points to highly interconnected banking activities between Feinberg and Jeffrey Epstein. The records include filings from an SEC whistleblower that allege Cerebus and Steven Feinberg were tied to financial structures, aka money laundering shell companies that were linked to Epstein. And then we have Norenco, because remember, the Congresswoman Nancy Mace says Epstein's connected to Steven Feinberg and DynCorp. Also, Norenco, a Chinese state-owned defense conglomerate and major weapons manufacturer and exporter. In the early 1980s, Epstein left Bear Stearns. He came to be associated with British businessman and arms dealer Douglas Leese, who introduced him to Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, who later became deeply involved in the Iran-Contra arms network. Former Epstein associate Stephen Hoffenberg later alleged that Epstein learned the international arms business under Douglas Leese, including the use of offshore companies, financial structures, and intermediaries, which is, how to hide your money. And that around 1983, Epstein participated in transactions involving Chinese Norenco weapons being sold to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. Starting in 1985, the Iran-Contra operation, using a network involving Adnan Khashoggi and Israeli intermediaries to finance weapons going to Iran. Okay, look at the timing. At that time, Epstein would have already been inside the international arms dealing circle. that Iran-Contra eventually relied upon. He knew all the people that were involved with Iran-Contra, and that is what Nancy Mace is saying in this letter to the director of the CIA. Why would you have almost nothing on this guy in your files if he spent decades intersecting with people the CIA absolutely knew about? All right, so now we have to go back to John Negroponte, because there's more. He was the U.S. ambassador to Honduras from 1981 to 1985, exactly when Honduras was acting as a base for the U.S.-backed Contra War against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The evidence places Jeffrey Epstein in the early 1980s arms dealing network around Iran-Contra, and it's not a stretch to say that John Negroponte and Jeffrey Epstein could have occupied overlapping circles. And we know that John's younger brother Nicholas would become close friends with Jeffrey Epstein, and his media lab would accept a ton of money from him and try to hide it. But we're not done with John Negroponte, because there's more. The worst is yet to come. Back to his meteoric career rise, because somehow none of this ended his career. He just kept climbing the ladder. People knew that John Negroponte didn't just sit in Honduras completely ignorant to the CIA-funded Contra rebellion. He was the chief logistical manager, and in his secure back-channel communications to CIA Director William Casey and National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, he referred to the Contra War as our special project. He also actively managed a PR campaign to maintain the fiction that Honduras was not serving as a training and staging ground for 15,000 anti-Sandinista rebels. And he explicitly ordered his staff to block congressional delegations from visiting the Contra camps to avoid blowing the CIA's cover. Okay? He omitted and downplayed systemic human rights abuses and tortures and executions carried out by the CIA-trained military Unit 316, the unit trained in Honduras under his watchful gaze. Now, Honduran officials say that Negroponte's entire focus was on defeating the Sandinistas, and human rights abuses were treated with tolerance and silence because the U.S. needed Honduras to act as the staging pad for the Contra army. Like I said, initially Congress supported giving aid to the Contras. They basically funded them and they were trying to help them. But in 1983, when they voted to halt that aid, John Negroponte sent back-channel messages to Washington, and he urged the White House to find a way to keep the secret arms deal alive, the Iran-Contra arms deal. He also met with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North several times, the very same man who masterminded Iran-Contra, and this was all well known inside the government. Eventually, it would become well known outside of the government and the subject of an investigation. But John Negroponte was not shamed or blocked from public service or from government service, which can only mean that everyone in the government, who mattered at least, who had the power to make that decision, approved of what he was doing. So instead of him being kind of like blacklisted from, being a civil worker or a government worker, Ronald Reagan brought him into the National Security Council, where John Negroponte served as the Deputy National Security Advisor until 1989. And then George H.W. Bush appointed John Negroponte ambassador to Mexico from 1989 until 1993 during the NAFTA negotiations. And then from 1997 to 2001, John Negroponte took a break from government and worked as an executive at, get this, McGraw-Hill, the publishing company that provides physical and digital textbooks for K-12 students, college students, and medical and business professionals. You literally cannot make this up. He was an executive at the publishing company that merged with Robert Maxwell's publishing company, Macmillan, to create the second largest textbook publisher in the United States. And then, after that, George W. Bush appointed John Negroponte as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And then, bam, 9/11 happens, and John Negroponte is suddenly the American ambassador at the UN during one of the most consequential periods in modern U.S. foreign policy: Afghanistan, the war on terror, Iraq. He becomes one of the administration's key diplomats in the UN battles over Iraq and weapons inspections. And remember, George Bush, he said, Saddam Hussein, he has nuclear weapons, biological weapons. And we know, yes, the country did have those things in the past, and they used them against, other people. But George Bush was saying, that Saddam Hussein was rebuilding these programs and in the intention, obviously, to use them against the United States. Because look, 9/11, right? Like, this is what's happening, right? So now George Bush is like, we got to go in. We got to go into Iraq. We have to invade them because obviously, like, you don't want something like this to happen on U.S. soil again, right? So now we got to go in and invade them in 2003. And then what happened after the invasion? Well, it was discovered that no, in fact, Iraq did not possess these biological nuclear weapons of mass destruction, or they were not rebuilding their programs. That was not happening. And John Negroponte was part of the administration implementing all of that policy, and apparently also part of the reason that the Bush administration believed that certain intelligence existed to show that these weapons of mass destruction existed. John Negroponte was kind of over here like, yeah, I heard word about these programs, but wait, there's more. In 2004, Bush sent John Negroponte to Baghdad as America's first ambassador to a post-invasion Iraq. This was an enormous embassy, one of the most sensitive diplomatic jobs on earth. And do you notice the historic parallel between 1980s Honduras and 2004 Iraq? American-backed foreign government plus insurgency plus intelligence operations plus counterinsurgency using locally organized security forces. When I'm talking about locally organized, I mean in these other countries, using locally organized security forces against insurgents. And you know what happened in Iraq, right? When the Pentagon deployed retired U.S. Colonel James Steele to organize and advise Iraqi Shiite and Kurdish police commandos to hunt down Sunni insurgents, leading to systematic torture and death squad violence. History sure does repeat itself when John Negroponte is around. And then after the intelligence failures surrounding 9/11 and Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, Congress created a new position in the government, the Director of National Intelligence, a very important figure who would coordinate the CIA, coordinate the NSA, FBI intelligence, military intelligence, and the rest of the sprawling U.S. intelligence community. And in 2005, George W. Bush gave this coveted position a person to sit above all other people, a person to sit above all intelligence agencies and make the whole intelligence machine communicate. He gave this position to John Negroponte, who became the very first director of national intelligence in United States history. That is quite a resume. That is the brother of Nicholas Negroponte, founder of the MIT Media Lab. Quite a shadow to stand in, I would say, but don't worry, Nick will also make a name for himself. Okay, so John Negroponte, his little brother Nicholas, they're born into a very wealthy Greek shipping magnate family. Their family existed in a really, obviously, international world of shipping, business, Europe, the United States, wealth, global connections, all of that. You know, they know people. They knew people. Nicholas would go on to study architecture at MIT. He earned both his undergraduate degree and his master's degree there in 1966. And he tells the same story in almost every interview about how in high school he was trying to decide what to study, and he always did very well in math, but he was also interested in art, and he was winning prizes for art. And so this is how he decided to study architecture, because he believed it combined math and art into the perfect career for him.
I was convinced at the age of 17 I would be an artist. Because I'd won all the art prizes at school, and I had done things always in art, and always drawing and going to museums as a little child on my own, actually. I think I went off to museums at the age of 7 and 8 on my own. But I made a mistake in the sense that I did very well in math too, and got an 800 in my math, whatever it was called, SAT, or the achievements, and went to the headmaster. I was always very ballsy about things like that. I went to the headmaster of the school and I said, you know, I got 800 in my math and I love art, and so obviously I should go into architecture because it's where the two meet. And this headmaster of this private school in Connecticut was very smart. And he said something to me that was extraordinary. He said, you know, I like gray suits and I like pinstripe suits, but I hate gray pinstripe suits. And that was so extraordinary that I went to architecture school, and in fact, I did 2 degrees in architecture before I realized that it was the gray pinstripe suit, and that really the mix of the two was computers.
He loves that story. He's very impressed with himself. He loves this story. He always pauses at exactly the right moments to wait for the laugh that he knows is going to come. So after he finished his master's degree in 1966, MIT did something that was fairly unusual. They promoted a freshly graduated Nicholas Negroponte directly onto the architecture faculty. He became a professor at MIT right after he graduated. And by this time, he claims he was fascinated by a question that not a lot of people were pondering in the 1960s, because Nicholas Negroponte is cutting edge, always has been, always will be. Now, he said, what if the computer were not merely a calculating machine? Could a person and a computer interact? Could they have a conversation? Could the computer learn what the person liked and understand what the person was trying to accomplish? At that point, computers were not what they are now, right? They were enormous, expensive machines that were used primarily for mathematics, scientific calculations, military work, data processing, like huge things that would take up a whole room. But Nicholas Negroponte's pondering about computer and human cooperation brought together his architecture background with the emerging fields of AI and cybernetics. So a normal computer-aided design system would say, tell me what to draw. But Negroponte imagined the computer would say, tell me what you're trying to accomplish, and maybe I can help you figure it out. We can work as a team, computer and human together forever. And then in 1967, only 1 year after joining MIT's faculty, Negroponte and this other guy, Leon Grosser, established what became known as the Architecture Machine Group, or AMG. Now, this became a lab for experimenting with computer graphics, interactive displays, touchscreens, human-computer interaction. Understand, this is happening in like the 1960s, which is bananas to think about, but Nicholas Negroponte increasingly believed that the most interesting thing about computers wasn't their ability to calculate, it was their potential to become extensions of human thought and perception. So here's Marvin Minsky talking about AMG, and this is interesting and important for many reasons. First of all, Marvin Minsky was the legendary MIT cognitive scientist considered a founding father of artificial intelligence. Thanks, Marvin. And he also maintained a close multi-decade relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. He was considered Epstein's closest friend at MIT. He visited Epstein in jail. He organized academic symposiums on Epstein Island, even after Epstein became a convicted sex offender. In fact, Marvin Minsky was probably one of the top people to help Epstein launder his reputation after his conviction, vouching for him amongst academic and scientific circles. And Marvin Minsky had such a really, honestly, perfectly polished reputation. Like, he was known in these academic and scientific circles to be very top tier. You know, if Marvin Minsky said something was good, it was good. So Virginia Giuffre testified under oath that Jeffrey Epstein directed and forced her to have sex with Marvin Minsky during one of these island symposiums. In fact, I was going to ask you to put a pin in this, but I'm just going to tell you now, because we'll get back to Marvin Minsky talking about Nicholas Negroponte and the AMG lab in a second. But I want to tell you this now because it's only building on what I believe is evidence that a subculture existed at MIT made up of people who not only took money from Epstein, but defended him because they didn't believe what he was doing was actually all that wrong. Exhibit A, I introduce you to Richard Stallman, a computer scientist and free software pioneer, a visiting scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, and president of the Free Software Foundation, who in September of 2019 had to resign from MIT due to what he called pressure on MIT and me over a series of misunderstandings and mischaracterizations. So these misunderstandings and mischaracterizations, they came from a lot of things, actually. I was going to say they came from a leaked email thread. That's where it started. So they came from a leaked email thread where Stallman was talking to his colleagues, and this was a thread in like the lab at MIT that he worked with. So he was defending Marvin Minsky, which I suppose to some extent is fine because Stallman knew Marvin Minsky. He was kind of like his mentor. And by the time Virginia Giuffre's allegations were made public, Marvin Minsky had passed away and couldn't defend himself. However, it gets worse because early in the thread, Stallman said, quote, "The word assaulting presumes that he applied force or violence in some unspecified way, but the article itself did say no such thing, only that they had sex. The most plausible scenario is that she presented herself to Minsky as entirely willing. Assuming she was being coerced by Epstein, he would have had every reason to conceal that from most of his associates," end quote. So someone else in the thread pointed out that Virginia Giuffre was only 17 years old at the time of the incident, which is not only creepy and weird because Marvin Minsky would have been like 74 or 75 years old at that time, and Virginia Giuffre was 17, and Marvin Minsky was a whole-ass married person, but it also made it sexual assault, rape in the Virgin Islands. And to this, Richard Stallman said, quote, "I think it is morally absurd to define rape in a way that depends on minor details, such as which country it was in or whether the victim was 18-year-old or 17. We know that Giuffre was being coerced into sex by Epstein. She was being harmed, but the details do not affect whether and to what extent Minsky was responsible for that," end quote. But here is the issue. After all of this came out, people discovered some other questionable takes that Stallman had published throughout the years on his own blog. So I have to be very careful about what words I use in discussing this next thing. So just for your information, when I say the word PDF, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who like to keep the company of children, which makes them PDFs. Okay, I can't say the word because YouTube will demonetize me because apparently it's a free-for-all on YouTube, except when you start talking about crimes against children, and then they don't want you to talk about that. They don't want people to be talking about it. But in 2006, in a post discussing a pro-PDF political party in the Netherlands, Stallman wrote, quote, "I am skeptical of the claim that voluntary PDF harms children." I wish I could speak and use words like an adult, but he's saying voluntary keeping the company of children harms children. Like, as in saying, if they're okay with it and they're doing it voluntarily, how does it harm them? Children. With adults, okay? In 2013, Stallman doubled down on this, writing, quote, "There is little evidence to justify the widespread assumption that willing participation in PDF hurts children," end quote. Once again, voluntary participation of children in sexual activity with adults. There is just not a lot of evidence to show that that actually hurts them. Commenting on a judicial nomination in 2003, Stallman argued that several banned sexual acts and materials, and he explicitly named CSAM as this material, should, quote, "be legal as long as no one is coerced," end quote. He claims that they were only outlawed due to narrow-mindedness and prejudice. So CSAM, as long as, once again, the kids are cool with it, it shouldn't be outlawed. The only reason it's outlawed is because people are narrow-minded about things, okay? As long as, there's consenting adults. No, not consenting adults. That's not what he thought. As long as there's consenting humans, I mean, who cares about their age and if they're adults or not? They're children, they're consenting. They can consent, right? As long as there's consenting humans involved, then, it's a free-for-all. We shouldn't be so narrow-minded. We shouldn't have prejudice against these people. You like what you like. And in 2018, Stallman publicly defended Cody Wilson, a tech figure who pleaded guilty to having sex with an underage girl, saying the girl engaged in, quote, "entirely willing sex with him," end quote. Oh, and in 2006, Stallman said, quote, "Many Americans would see a scandal in the DHS spokesman who has been arrested for proposing sex to a 14-year-old girl through the internet. I too see a scandal, but not the same one. I think the scandal is that this man is going to face a prison sentence when he has not done wrong to anyone," end quote. Because according to Stallman, just proposing the act to, what was it, a 13 or 14-year-old girl, that's not wrong, okay? That's not, he didn't do anything. He didn't follow through on anything. By the way, this person was not facing like a ton of time in prison, but anyways, that's neither here nor there. This is what Richard Stallman believes and what he feels. And in 2019, after he'd been exposed for all of this, Stallman made an edit to his blog, a retraction actually. Quote, "Many years ago, I posted that I cannot see anything wrong about sex between an adult and a child if the child accepted it. Through personal conversations in recent years, I have learned to understand how sex with a child can harm her psychologically. This changed my mind about the matter. I think adults should not do that." End quote. Oh, I mean, it sounds like kind of somebody was holding a gun to his head when he wrote that retraction. Another comment made by Stallman, however, says, quote, "Please do not use the word children or child to refer to anyone under the age of 18. A 17-year-old is not a child. A 13-year-old is a teenager," end quote. So apparently, for Richard Stallman, you are only a child if you are 12 and under. So yeah, the dude's gross. But anyways, let's hear from Marvin Minsky, who was close to Epstein and also very close with Nicholas Negroponte, and listen to how Minsky described Nicholas Negroponte's architecture machine group, his lab at MIT.
Nicholas Negroponte had a laboratory with a strange title. It was called the Architecture Machine. And I think maybe this was because Nicholas' PhD thesis was based on a really remarkably humorous and interesting idea. I don't know if I can explain it. There was a box that had a lot of guinea pigs and a lot of little wooden blocks. And in the course of their activities, the guinea pigs would run into the blocks and push them around. Nicholas had some system which would record, maybe just photograph, where the blocks were each day, and he arranged some kind of plotting machine which would, I think we may have to erase all this. He had this machine which would observe that a block had been moved and reach down and move it back, and then he would record whether the guinea pigs paid any attention to this or appeared to have any intentions about where they wanted the block to be. I give up. I can't remember the purpose. But anyway, that was called the architecture machine at first, and then he had more students, and Nicholas was incredibly productive at the beginning of computer science, of thinking of things that no one else imagined computers doing.
Okay, I don't know if Marvin Minsky forgot or never understood what the experiment was. But it's interesting that he calls the animals in this experiment guinea pigs, when in fact the animals in the experiment were gerbils. But we all understand what the term guinea pig means in science. We understand what it means if you're saying to somebody, "Oh, you're using me as a guinea pig," right? So Minsky is talking about something called Black World, an early experiment done by AMG to see whether a computer could cope with unpredictable living beings instead of a perfectly controlled world. So the gerbils in this scenario, or the guinea pigs, as Marvin Minsky referred to them, were us, humans. And the objective was, can a machine observe the behavior of living occupants in a world, learn what they do, and adapt the environment to their apparent preferences? Negroponte later described the idea as having the machine watch the gerbils interact with their habitat and gradually learn their living preferences. In other words, if the gerbils repeatedly changed the environment in a certain way, maybe the computer could learn and infer, hey, the gerbils, humans, seem to like it arranged this way. And then the computer will begin responding accordingly and make the environment what the gerbils want. That was the very early version of an idea that later became central to MIT's Media Lab. The environment watches you. It learns from you. It changes itself for you. So things like smart homes, adaptive interfaces, personalized AI, conceptually, they all live downstream of that central idea that came from Nicholas Negroponte and his AMG lab in the 60s. But the gerbils in this experiment, aka the humans, because that's what he really intends them to be, because that's what he's studying, in my opinion. But the gerbils in Black World, they did something that the designers hadn't really anticipated. They were far more disruptive, chaotic, and inventive than the machine's model expected. The computer had an internal representation of how the city was supposed to be arranged, and the gerbils would bump blocks, topple towers, they would rearrange things, and then the robot would try to restore the structures or adjust them. So if the computer was like, hey, the gerbils actually like this tower this way instead of the way I had it, they like it kind of like on its side. So the computer would like restore and adjust the structures to how it seemed the gerbils liked it, but the animals kept changing their mind about what they liked and how they wanted everything to look and be. They kept changing their mind about how they wanted their environment to look and exist around them. The animals, the gerbils, kept creating situations that the programmers had not planned on. They hadn't anticipated on. Now, before I tell you where I'm going with this, I need to drop in another factor, which is that AMG ran substantially on government money, specifically the Office of Naval Research and ARPA, which was the predecessor to DARPA, the research arm of the Pentagon, all housed inside the Department of Defense. Basically, the money for the AMG, Nicholas Negroponte's first lab, it basically came from the Department of Defense. So not just government money, military money. And let me draw your attention to the Aspen Movie Map, a 1978 AMG project funded by DARPA, which allowed a user to virtually navigate the streets of Aspen using recorded images and an interactive interface. It sounds really quaint, like how fun in the 70s. Like, how fun is this? We can do this. We can go to Aspen. We'll never go to Aspen, really, but we can go there on the computer. Why would DARPA, a government branch created during the Cold War to keep U.S. military technology ahead of other countries, why would DARPA want to fund a fun little project like that? Because the Aspen Movie Map is generally credited with being an early version of Google Maps with Street View. Because if you strip away the tour around Aspen presentation, the underlying technology is the same. It's useful for things like remote navigation, simulation, training, spatial orientation, command and control interfaces, and giving someone an interactive visual representation of a place they're not physically standing in. Now, I am going to say that from what I see, AMG, which would eventually become a part of MIT's Media Lab, helped develop the technological building blocks that later became useful to the surveillance society we find ourselves living in currently. Can a computer watch us and adapt to us? Can it know where we are at all times? Can it understand our gestures? Can we digitally map physical space? Can machines learn from our preferences? Decades later, those same capabilities would become enormously valuable to everyone who makes money, right? Advertisers, social media platforms, corporations, intelligence agencies, law enforcement. So in 1970, Nicholas Negroponte and AMG, they're looking at Block World and they're saying, hey, the gerbil moved this block repeatedly. Maybe it likes the environment arranged this way. In 2026, now I have 1 million devices watching me, right? In 2026, it's Stephanie watched this video on TikTok for 43 seconds. Stephanie Googled this subject. She drove to this store. She purchased these shoes. She messaged these people. She bought these products. She listened to this podcast. She stopped scrolling when she saw this photograph. She asked her Alexa to play her this musical artist 121 times this month. We have a pretty good idea about who she is and what she likes. It's the same conceptual move. It's the same thing. Observe behavior, collect data, infer preference and intention, adapt to the system. By the way, we also know the layout of Stephanie's home because she has a Wi-Fi connected vacuum. We know she's fighting with her mother, so let's show her content that supports the way she's feeling. So she watches that and feels more sure she's right about the situation instead of calling her mom and apologizing and working it out. We know that on nights, her smart ring tells us she doesn't sleep well. She's making an early run to the coffee shop and her blood pressure's up. It's what Nicholas Negroponte calls habitat influence. And it feels like it became less about how can these computers learn about you to make your environment what you want, and more about how can these computers learn about you to make your environment more of what we want. And when I say what we want, I don't mean you and me. I mean them. And who is them? Well, it depends. Whether you're speaking in a consumer context, where they probably want your environment to be filled with a bunch of stuff you don't need and probably shouldn't be wasting money on, and a bunch of stuff that's actually just further tracking you, whether it's listening to you or you have cameras all over your house or you have speakers all over your house or, like I said, a smart vacuum, things that are Wi-Fi connected. and are listening or watching or mapping or collecting data, or if, the they I'm talking about is maybe people who want your environment to be tailored to keep you exhausted, distracted, and too hopeless to realize what's happening in the world around you. Because as your direct environment becomes smaller and smaller, and it becomes more relegated to your own home and the screens inside of it, you're going out less, you're socializing less, because all conversations and fun and entertainment can be happening at home with my screen. I can play video games with my friends and interact with them through my headphones. I don't need to be at their house. So while we're all living in Ready Player One at home, the larger environment out there, society, culture, the world stage, it can become what it needs to become for those who are the architects of it, the architects of the machine. And it can do that without you, like you, me, and you, noticing. And if you do notice, well, then you're the problem and you're behaving in a way that the designers of the environment didn't expect.
We anticipated all sorts of problems, but the one I didn't think of was when this mechanical arm came down on a block and there was a gerbil sitting on top. I don't know if you've had gerbils, but when you squeeze them, it goes awfully far. And it didn't kill any gerbils, but you really get a lot of gerbil on each side and almost nothing in between.
Just remember, you're always being watched, and as long as you enjoy your influenced habitat and you keep watching football every Sunday and you keep clicking on the Netflix recommendations and the internet ads and hearting your friends' posts, you're good. But if you don't like your influenced habitat and you want to get all the other gerbils together to stand on top of the blocks and look for a way out, you might get squished. You might get squished. And you'd be surprised how much of a gerbil can be on either side of a metal plate. Okay, so by the late 1970s, John Negroponte expanded his thinking, and he said, listen, this is what the future looks like. 3 enormous industries are going to collide: computers, publishing, broadcasting. These industries are going to merge into one digital ecosystem in a theory he called convergence. And this may seem painfully obvious to us today in 2026 when our phones are our televisions, our newspapers, our cameras, our radio, our music collection, our publishing platform. But Negroponte was talking about this convergence very early on in the 70s, before the personal computer revolution had fully happened. It had barely started, honestly. And that is really what led to the Media Lab, which came to fruition with the help of a very powerful institutional ally, Jerome Wisner, who was the president of MIT, but who had also previously been the science advisor to President John F. Kennedy. So Wisner and Negroponte came up with an unconventional idea for an entirely new lab. Instead of creating a singular department that would focus on a singular area of academic or scientific interest, they wanted everything under one roof. Artists, engineers, musicians, architects, journalists, cognitive scientists, computer researchers, all working together. And in 1985, the MIT Media Lab officially opened, with Nicholas Negroponte as its co-founder and first director. And a lot of what later looked eccentric about the Media Lab is really just Negroponte's personality, turned into an institution. He disliked academic silos. He liked people who didn't quite belong anywhere. He called them misfits. He believed prototypes were more valuable than long theoretical papers. He was very big on the mantra, like demo or die, like make something that people can see, make something that they can interact with. It's not about, normal scientific research and academia is like publish or perish. And John Negroponte was like, no, who cares about publishing papers? Demo or die, make something. I want to be able to show people something that came out of the Media Lab. And there's a reason for this. We're going to talk about it. But he believed that industry should finance speculative research without dictating exactly what came out of the research. Does that make sense? I'll explain it more later, but basically he was like, everyone should give us money, but not tell us what to do with that money. Negroponte liked combining fields that normally didn't communicate, and most importantly, he believed that computers were going to become a part of everyday life. And Nicholas Negroponte wanted the weirdest of the weird people to be a part of the MIT Media Lab. He's described the lab as bringing together misfit faculty, the same people who would make traditional research institutions uncomfortable. The person doing something too strange, too out there for their field of study. And that is why the early Media Lab had such a strong anti-discipline streak. And that's why the early Media Lab attracted a certain type of personality who maybe was kind of restless, maybe kind of obsessive, maybe kind of risk tolerant.
We had to publish when you had a faculty position, you had to publish its availability and affirmative action and other good reasons. And I remember in one of the advertisements, I said, if you can get a faculty position at another university, take it. Don't apply. But if you really are, I don't think I used the word misfit, but that's what I certainly meant, come see us. And the only problem with that is that you get 50 people, 48 of which are kind of not just misfits, they're kind of,
sociopaths.
But then the one or two who aren't, it became a home for people, a place where they could do things safely.
And maybe it's possible that one or two psychopaths slipped through the application process, just saying. So that brings us to Media Lab funding, which, yes, was still coming from governmental sources, right? AMG, the Architect Machine Group, was like a precursor to the Media Lab. AMG, heavily funded by the government. Media Lab, yes, still kind of funded by the government, but not really at the beginning. I want to be very clear about that. Not really at the beginning. The Media Lab had a unique financing model during the late 90s tech boom, something they called sponsorship.
And I happened to be in an era when Hollywood and other media interests were slightly terrified about what the future would be. So to hedge against that future, they would fund places like the Media Lab. So I remember coming here to MCA Universal, and Sid Sheinberg said, "We will rain money on you." And I thought, that's like kind of nice, a nice thing to. And so the Media Lab actually was funded by almost every studio, because once one studio did it, then the others,
of course,
sort of copied, and it was, Barry Diller might have been the one who had the courage first to do it, and then other people followed him.
Early on, the MIT Media Lab never faced any issues with money or funding. As you just heard Nicholas Negroponte say, the money was raining and it was pouring, and they never had any issues. They had as much as they could handle. You also heard them say that every studio in Hollywood wanted to be involved, and if they didn't at first, they would, once they saw their competition, get on board. And this was seen repeated in almost every industry that would become involved in the Media Lab. Nicholas Negroponte's pitch was to tell these corporations that their entire industry was going to go digital, whether they liked it or not. And the Media Lab was building the future before anyone else. They could either be inside the room watching it happen and taking advantage of it, or they could watch their competitors enter the room without them. So corporations would pay a minimum of $200,000 to buy into the Media Lab. And this fee granted them royalty-free rights to whatever cool, eccentric, futuristic prototypes the lab researchers created. And not just what your specific donation paid for, by the way. You weren't giving $200,000 and I want to study microchips. You were giving $200,000 to the Media Lab as a whole. And then anything the lab created, no matter who funded it, you would have royalty-free access to it. And once one major corporation in an industry joined in, it created pressure on all of its competitors. Warner Brothers becomes a Media Lab sponsor, and that causes Disney to wonder, what is Warner seeing at MIT that we aren't? Then Disney joins, followed by Paramount. And then the Media Lab is swimming in money because they created FOMO for an entire industry. The same thing goes for electronics. If Sony joins the Media Lab, then Panasonic's going to join. And then Philips is going to join. And then Samsung. If one major telecom company gets Media Lab access to experimental networking and communications research, its rivals don't want to be left out in the cold, obviously. IBM, Apple, HP, all of them trying to anticipate what the next computer platform is going to be. Even toys. Once Lego started working around programmable toys and learning technology at the Media Lab, competing toy companies had to join as well. The Media Lab wasn't really selling any anything, really. Weren't selling any tangible research. They were selling access and proximity to the future. Nicholas Negroponte was a showman, right? The greatest showman. He was monetizing corporate anxiety and fear for this new wave of the future that was coming, whether you like it or not, whether you get on board or get left behind. Kind of like the way that they're monetizing our fear now, like what they're doing with AI to us now, monetizing with fear, right? Like AI is coming. It's either going to take your job or you're going to learn how to work with it. You're going to learn how to work with that computer. Yeah, monetizing fear. Nicholas Negroponte didn't promise to invent anything. The Media Lab didn't promise to invent anything. He was saying, we have no idea what we're going to invent, but your competitor is going to see it years before you do. Now, when a corporate sponsor paid into the Media Lab, it was typically a multi-year commitment, and there were tiers above that $200,000. So that was kind of a starting $200,000. And then if you were, say, Stephanie Incorporated, I'm going to pay $200,000, but when I sign and say I'm paying $200,000 for this year, I'm also saying that I'm going to do that for the next 5 years. So there was like guaranteed money too. Motorola paid $5 million to establish the Digital DNA Lab in 1999 inside the Media Lab. And the objective there was, let's make everything a computer, put processing chips into ordinary everyday objects, and then have them communicate with each other. Let's have your phone talk to your washing machine, and your phone can talk to your refrigerator, and your phone can talk to your car. Let's create a common digital nervous system. And at that time, ideas were being thrown around, like putting computerized tags into clothing so that the washing machine would be communicated with, and it would tell the washing machine what cycle to use for the clothing. Like, how lazy are we at this point? At this point, how lazy are we? Or household appliances would communicate things like energy consumption or noise levels. Yeah. So what does that mean? Because that's where we live now. What the DNA digital lab that Motorola established at MIT with their $5 million endowment, what that created was what we live in now. The computer disappears because the environment itself becomes computerized. We live in a smart digital world. That is what Motorola and the Media Lab were doing, is the early prototype for what we now call the Internet of Things, which is ironically what the CIA tool Weeping Angel called the smart device world. The Internet of Things. The Internet of Things that the CIA targeted to conduct covert surveillance. And this was revealed in the WikiLeaks 2017 Vault 7 leak. We talk about this in the Missing Scientist series. I won't spend too much time on it now, but the CIA came up with an implant for certain Samsung smart TVs, which once installed would make the TV looked like it was in a fake off mode. The TV appeared to be powered down to anyone in the room while the microphone on the TV continued to record whatever was happening in that room. And that's what the CIA referred to as, basically bugging the Internet of Things and turning the Internet of Things into surveillance tools. So what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Was this technology created at the Media Lab for corporations to create products to sell to people? Or was it created for the government to spy on people? Does it really matter if by this point, that technology has been used to do both things, right? To waste our money and also make sure we have zero privacy. So during the tech boom, 90s going into the early 2000s, Nicholas Negroponte created a corporate-funded intellectual playground at the Media Lab. And the lab's budget grew extraordinarily fast. During its first decade, the annual budget increased by roughly 30% per year, and corporate money accounted for about 95% of the Media Lab's budget. 95%. Meaning, even if they are taking government money at the beginning, it's not a lot. It's all coming from corporations. But was the military like a sponsor? Of course. Part of the government military would have been a sponsor, and that way they would have had access to every single thing that the Media Lab was creating, even if Samsung was the one paying the money or Disney or whatever. You know what I mean? And apparently, at that time, the Media Lab was just like the place to be. They were all loving it. They were living it up. Champagne, caviar, limos. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit. There might not have been caviar, but there was definitely limos and first-class travel. There was probably caviar too. What are we talking about here? If there was limos and champagne, there was caviar. But then another unanticipated thing happened to Nicholas Negroponte and his edgy, not like other girls Media Lab. In March of 2000, the NASDAQ peaked and the dot-com bubble burst. So over the next couple of years, the technology sector went through an enormous change, a contraction, right? Startups disappeared, telecom companies collapsed, technology stocks cratered, corporations began slashing expenses. And this is because, yes, Nicholas Negroponte and people like him are right. The future's coming, technology is going to be it, everything's going to be computers. But he was saying it too soon, and he and other people, I'm not just saying him, they were kind of making it seem like in 5 years, we're going to be living in the Jetsons, but it didn't happen that fast. But everyone was kind of afraid it was. So people just started investing in like tech startups and all of this stuff. And then they realized like, we don't really have the technological infrastructure to support like these things that these tech startups want to do. And so that's why the .com bubble, it popped, not because the technology wasn't coming. It just wasn't there yet. So unfortunately for the Media Lab, the companies getting crushed were exactly the companies paying its bills. The Media Lab had received huge amounts of support from telecom and technology companies, but after the telecom bubble collapsed, companies like Lucent and Nortel were no longer in the mood to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars funding speculative university research. A Media Lab professor described the problem to Wired in 2003, and this professor said, quote, "Those companies are fucking dead." And then the professor asked the obvious question, where do we get the money from now? Where do we get the money from now is exactly how Jeffrey Epstein entered the picture at MIT, and how moral hardlines disappeared in favor of dollar signs. Because another problem was the Media Lab had gotten huge because they had so much money. They're like expanding. Like, yeah, let's add another wing. Let's let's add a, tennis court, but I don't know if they had a tennis court. I'm just saying they were expanding. By the early 2000s, the Media Lab had around 280 researchers and professors and a roughly $40 million annual budget. The Media Lab had built an institution around the assumption that this tech boom would continue and just increase. But when corporate sponsorship weakened, when companies were like, okay, we can't keep doing this, like we're way ahead of ourselves and the technology is not catching up and we're not getting the products that we're like paying for. At that point, a lot of corporate sponsors pulled out or lowered their endowment, but the Media Lab still had salaries, students, equipment, admin staff, and one particularly expensive tradition, the Media Lab graduate students would generally receive tuition plus stipends rather than paying for graduate school themselves. So by 2003, the Media Lab supporting a graduate student could cost the lab more than $75,000 per year. So in late 2001, the Media Lab had to lay off 29 staff members. And after this, the then director, Walter Bender, began attacking what he called the lab's burn rate problem. And he's saying, like, we're spending too much and we got to cut and eliminate some of these expenses. And among the expenses that were eliminated were first-class flights, limousines, free food and snacks at meetings, undergraduate wages were cut, graduate students were limited to one out-of-town conference per year. And you can understand this would be very annoying to the misfit Media Lab, where they're like, we just want all the money to do whatever we want. We want to be kooky and weird, and we want to stand on our heads, and we want to wear roller skates to work. And now you're telling us that we have to rein ourselves in and not do the things of one out-of-town conference a year, no first class. This is ludicrous. I work at the Media Lab. Now, understand, the Media Lab had historically been heavily independent of the traditional federal research funding system. And that unique independence, not having to take money from certain entities like the government, like the military, that unique independence had helped create the lab's culture of researchers saying, we don't know what this is going to become. We're just going to build it and see. The lab and the people who worked there had been able to be weird and try unconventional things. And yes, come up with some ideas and concepts that worked and were valuable, but basically also waste a lot of money doing other stuff that went nowhere, throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what stuck. So after the corporate money that allowed that freedom dried up, the Media Lab's future suddenly looked uncertain. And that's when they had to start getting money from whatever source offered it. According to Wired magazine, by 2003, approximately 1/3 of the Media Lab's budget was coming from government grants, including funding from the National Science Foundation. In 2004, Nicholas Negroponte said the Media Lab would increasingly need to seek government grants and research contracts, as well as foundations and private wealthy donors. Before this, Negroponte had told his people at the Media Lab, don't worry about money. Focus on your work. Leave the fundraising to me. But now, when the money's drying up, fundraising would become a core activity that everyone at the Media Lab was basically expected to participate in. And I think that's a big reason why Nicholas Negroponte appointed Joe Ito as the director of the Media Lab in 2011. Because the world that Joe Ito lived in was not an academic one. He didn't go to college. He was like a money guy, a finance guy, a venture capitalist. He lived in a world of venture capitalists, which also meant a world of wealthy philanthropists, Silicon Valley, people with money. And when the position was announced that Joe Ito was taking over as the director of the Media Lab, MIT highlighted that Ito had invested in more than 40 companies and sat on major nonprofit and corporate boards. This shift changed the Media Lab, though, right? Because the original idea was protective of intellectual freedom and creativity, and corporate sponsors were essentially buying access to an ecosystem, not an ownership of any specific project or idea, which means those corporate sponsorships aren't being like, we want you to research this and we want you to make this. The early foundation and ethos of the Media Lab was give smart, weird people money, don't tell them what to make and see what happens. And that worked because so many sponsors were contributing to the same pool. So a company wasn't commissioning its own private invention. When money was abundant, it was easy for the Media Lab to tell a corporate sponsor, well, we don't really care what you think. This is what we're interested in. This is what we're doing. Take it or leave it. Because if you don't pay us, your rival will, your competition will. But once sponsors were disappearing and the lab had to cut expenses, suddenly every dollar mattered, and giving a person or company the most bang for their buck might mean doing what that person or company wanted instead of what the Media Lab researchers and scientists wanted. Now, I'm not saying that the Media Lab was like, oh, we have no say anymore, and they just handed these corporations and sponsors the steering wheel. But it became much harder for them to pretend that the corporates and sponsors weren't passengers in their car and that their opinions didn't matter. If you're desperate for sponsor renewals, you are obviously going to become more aware of questions like, what are these sponsors interested in? What can we show them that demonstrates our value to their needs? What problems are they dealing with that we can solve? How can we prove ourselves worthy so that they keep coming back year after year and giving us money because we've given them something? The current Media Lab now describes the way they handle corporate sponsorships as bringing their business challenges and concerns to the lab and seeing what solutions researchers present. That's a lot different than we're over here wearing, different colored socks and roller skates, and we have our hair in space buns, and we're going to make whatever we want. And then you just, if you don't like it, you don't have to be a part of this cutting edge thing, our cool lab. It's a lot different. Now they're like, okay, bring us what you want us to make, and then we'll see what we can do. And when the Media Lab couldn't get enough corporate sponsors, they turned to the government. Remember, in the 90s, the Media Lab was funded 95% by corporate sponsors, companies like Samsung and Disney. That was what was happening. But by 2003, 25% of that budget was coming from government grants. I told you both of those figures, and the best example is Neil Gershenfield's Center for Bits and Atoms. This is a center that was created in 2001 using almost $14 million from the National Science Foundation. Suddenly, this hugely funded center of the lab was in the Media Lab. And then Neil Gershenfield was like, hey, I'm doing stuff that's like big and important, and we're getting a lot of money. So the focus needs to be here, not in your weird Media Lab science experiments. Like, what are you guys doing over here? Building a volcano and seeing if the lava can be green? Like, ugh, this is so lame. I'm doing important stuff. And the Center for Bits and Atoms was focused on a lot of stuff that overlapped with Jeffrey Epstein's specific interests. And during his October 2013 visit to the MIT campus, Epstein spent much of his time there with Neil Gershenfeld, who later told investigators that their discussions involved consciousness and signaling and deception by animals. So the Center for Bits and Atoms was trying to erase the boundary between the digital world and the physical one to make matter programmable. Neil Gershenfeld's Center for Bits and Atoms was trying to erase the boundary between the digital world and the physical one to make matter programmable, build machines that could build machines, explore quantum computation, and even treat biological systems as things that could potentially be engineered. Biological systems, like humans and animals and things like that. Those subjects overlapped almost perfectly with Epstein's documented obsessions with artificial intelligence, consciousness, evolution, genetics, and human enhancement. And that is the very reason that we cannot look at Jeffrey Epstein as simply saying he's a rich donor buying prestige or trying to fix his reputation after a hugely damaging criminal scandal. MIT and Joy Ito will try to make you feel bad for judging them due to their relationship with Epstein. They will try to say, well, we received the money, we needed the money. The Media Lab's very existence depended on keeping the donations coming in. What could we do in the name of science? But all Jeffrey Epstein did was donate. And yes, we shouldn't have taken it, but it's not like he had any pull or any say in what happened here. And I call bullshit on that, because they may not have handed Jeffrey Epstein the wheel to the car, but they had to start showing him as the passenger that his opinion and say mattered, or he might have asked them to pull over so he could get out altogether and go give his money to another institution who did listen to him, like Harvard, because that's what he did. He didn't pull out MIT, but yeah, Harvard is another college that we should talk about one day. So Epstein's donations to MIT were anonymous. So he wasn't getting any reputational dry cleaning from those donations. Yes, he had access to certain scientists and people at high levels in academia, but that was not all he wanted for his generosity, and also for all his hard work in getting his other rich friends to donate, like Leon Black and Bill Gates. He was trying to steer money towards scientific subjects and specific researchers that interested him personally and worked for him personally. Something he had an ulterior motive in. And obviously you can see how that might be a problem, and goes from some rich guy giving money for whatever the Media Lab wants to use it for to this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, giving money under the conditions that the money be used a specific and targeted way through MIT, with MIT and the Media Lab being the tool Epstein used to achieve his goals. In 2013, Jeffrey Epstein introduced Joy Ito to AI and cognitive science researcher Joshua Bach. We've talked about Joshua Bach. Guy's a weirdo. The Media Lab then hired Bach, and MIT's own internal investigation concluded that he was hired largely because Epstein subsidized the cost of his salary. In fact, Epstein gave $300,000 specifically to support the work and the research that Joshua Bach was doing. This was basically Epstein saying, here's my scientist, hire him so he can have access to the Media Lab's resources and he can do what I want him to do. Like I said, we've talked about Bach in past Epstein installments, but the kind of stuff he was interested in and actively working on while at MIT is genuinely terrifying. He was trying to reverse engineer the architecture of the human mind, motivation, emotion, memory, learning, social understanding, consciousness, self-modeling, and then he was trying to reproduce those principles of a human inside an artificial intelligence, what he calls AGI. AI that thinks and behaves like a human, but better, right? Smarter and better. And Bach has long been interested in building something that functions like an autonomous mind with its own motivations and its own consciousness. And he doesn't seem to understand the consequences of this. Actually, I think he does, which makes it worse. I think the better way to word that is that he doesn't care about the consequences. His basic philosophy is usually pretty non-human centered. It's pretty cold and robotic, honestly. In a 2023 essay on AGI risk, Bach wrote that humanity isn't going to be around forever anyways. It was always destined to be temporary. So when other people say, hey, this sounds weird, we might build something smarter than us, we may lose control of it, it could kill us. So let's slow things down until we know how to align this thing we're building with human survival. And Bach's response is, hey, humanity isn't immortal anyways. Let's just go as far as we possibly can and see what happens. It'll be fun. What's the worst that could happen? Humanity gets destroyed? I don't care about that. In 2018, Joshua Bach used a video game metaphor and described our current era as perhaps the last level for humanity to play. So here's what I want to lay out for you. Jeffrey Epstein was interested in transhumanism, particularly using genetic engineering and artificial intelligence to improve human beings and then figure out how to live forever, right? Scientists who knew him talked about having conversations with Epstein about his interest in cryonics, preserving the brain, his consciousness, so that future technology might potentially revive him, so that he could figure out a way to potentially live on forever. Epstein was cultivating scientists, connecting with them, forming relationships with them, having conversations with them, encouraging their research, telling them what they should research. He was doing that with scientists who were working on things like cognition, consciousness, genetics, evolution, neuroscience, artificial life. All of these things circle the same questions. Like, how fixed are we as human beings? Where does the soul of a human exist, or the central energy, like who you are outside of the shell of your body? Where does that exist? Where is it? Is it in the brain? Is it in, your energy? Is it, what is it? We don't know. Where is it? What does it look like? How can it be found and replicated? Epstein always talked with these brilliant scientists and researchers about the same topics. Are intelligence and personality fixed? Can genetics improve them? Can biological aging be defeated? Can consciousness exist without its original body? Can evolution become something humans deliberately direct rather than something that nature just does to us? And he brings Joshua Bach to MIT and prays for him to work there so that Bach can explore the answers to these questions and potentially create something that might be able to ensure a human consciousness or soul or energy can live on forever, even if not in the same human form it inhabits currently. Joshua Bach imagines a future in which minds are not tied to a specific biological substrate, right? Like an organic body, a human body. He imagines a future where organic bodies are just one possible kind of body, and where minds could be integrated into a larger collective artificial intelligence system, like the Matrix. He's even said that during a transition to like advanced AGI, it may be possible to preserve the informational complexity of existing human minds rather than simply destroying them, which is so kind, so thoughtful of you for considering that could be a possibility. And suppose we map every relevant feature of a brain perfectly. Suppose we map every relevant feature of my brain perfectly, and we program it into a computer. And then we have a digital Stephanie who wakes up, and digital Stephanie says, I know who I am. I remember my childhood. I know what my favorite color is. I remember my children. I remember filming Crime Weekly yesterday. I know what I had for lunch this past weekend. I know what vacation I'm taking next summer. We haven't necessarily moved the original consciousness, right? We've made a copy of it. And so if real biological Stephanie dies and digital Stephanie continues on with everything real Stephanie had, and then also the ability to make new memories, did the real Stephanie survive, or did the real Stephanie die and then just leave behind an extraordinarily convincing copy to continue on as if nothing happened? Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows what makes a human a human. We shouldn't know. We shouldn't know. This is not something that we should even be looking into, I think. It's very weird and dangerous, and I don't like it. It's icky, but we know Epstein was interested in it. He was interested in living on forever in some way, shape, or form. Joshua Bach says the human brain is just a computer. Your neurons communicate using electrochemical signals. So theoretically, if the technology and the knowledge gets to a place where Bach and Epstein and others think it will, couldn't you copy a consciousness from one human brain and then maybe like encode it over into another human brain, like the brain of a newborn baby? And theoretically, couldn't you just do that forever, hopping from one baby body to another? And we know that Epstein was interested in like having a baby ranch in New Mexico, right? And based on the science that currently exists from researchers that have been doing these things and research that's been happening for years at MIT and other places, couldn't you actually just like 3D or 4D print a human body and have your consciousness programmed into that? MIT is on the cutting edge in advancing 3D bioprinting by transitioning from printing basic static cell structures to creating functional, living human tissues that behave exactly like real organs. They have 3D and 4D printers that use bioinks, which is a mixture of living human cells and nutrient-rich hydrogels. Where are we getting like human cells from? What's happening here? Okay. Anyways, they have successfully printed functional muscle tissues that grow and mature over several days. And And they're talking about doing this for like organ transplants, right? Like if you don't need to get a donor and you have, less of a chance of your body rejecting like a new heart or new lungs, this would be great for organ transplants. But if they can make hearts and lungs and pancreases and livers and brains, then they can make a whole human with this stuff. It feels weird. It feels wrong. So in June of 2018, Joi Ito himself wrote an article for MIT. It was called The Responsibility of Immortality. Welcome to the New Transhumanism. And he referenced renowned Harvard geneticist George Church, who we also know was tightly enmeshed with Jeffrey Epstein. They were very good friends. This is the same George Church who pioneered the application of CRISPR to edit human stem cells and modify genomes, the same George Church who's done extensive work with synthetic biology, and he wants to bring back the woolly mammoths. Because he's never seen Jurassic Park, and the same George Church who created the Personal Genome Project and then took on Jeffrey Epstein as a participant in 2013. And he put Jeffrey Epstein at the front of the line in the Human Genome Project. Like, it's supposed to be anonymous. And George Church was like, conversating with the people at his lab. And he's like, hey, my friend Jeffrey Epstein's going to be in there. I need you to like make sure his samples get in real quick. And they were like, what? Why are we, giving this guy special treatment? But anyways, George Church's lab also received $686,000 from Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein talked to dozens of people about living forever and funding science to help that happen, and he placed Joshua Bach right at MIT's Media Lab where those kinds of scientific innovations were the most likely to happen. Additionally, Epstein bought influence over direction at MIT because in August of 2013, Joi Ito was talking with MIT officials about the possibility of having Epstein fund a new center examining design patterns for deception in evolutionary biology, which the whole idea of what he was interested Joi Ito and Jeffrey Epstein talked about deception in animals and humans all the time, and like, how do they evolve to be better at deceiving? Like, these people are weird, man. These people are super weird. So Joi Ito's like, we should have the Center for Deception in Evolutionary Biology, and MIT officials actually discussed how such funding for a center like that might be handled anonymously or through a third party. Now, the center apparently never ultimately received Epstein's funding, but it went far enough that it was being discussed at senior levels, like Epstein having his own like center that he funded at the Media Lab. Then later that year, Epstein emailed Joi Ito about it. According to the MIT report, Epstein wrote, quote, we should talk about funding for center, dollars control staff, whenever you are ready, end quote. Dollars control staff. Like, I'm giving you money, I'm going to tell you who's working there. Once again, this goes very different from MIT's earlier, model of taking money from sponsorships and then we're going to make what we make and you have access to it. Now you have somebody like Jeffrey Epstein giving them money because they're desperate for it. And he's saying, I'm going to control what you're doing and who's working there and what your focus is. And that's a problem. And Joi Ito forwarded that message from Epstein to Media Lab professor Kevin Slavin. And shortly afterward, Joi Ito told MIT's development office that Epstein was interested in funding the development of a new initiative connected to his earlier funding. That's very hard to reconcile with an image of Epstein as merely a passive philanthropist. He's talking about a center, a subject he's interested in, money to fund it, and staffing. I give you money, I control staffing. That starts looking much more like, he's buying an institution. The proposed center would have studied how living things trick each other, why those tricks work, and whether the same basic tricks keep showing up across evolution. Like, how are people and animals, I guess, but in theory, yes, people, what makes them really good liars? And how do they evolve to be better liars? And where do these patterns of lying and deception keep popping up? So we already know that Nicholas Negroponte was very clearly in favor of taking Jeffrey Epstein's money. He coached Joi Ito on how to cultivate Epstein into a major donor, and he's all over the emails in the Epstein files. In 2016, when Joi Ito was worried about whether Epstein should attend Marvin Minsky's memorial publicly because of the press and the reputational risk to MIT, he went to Nicholas Negroponte and he kind of floated the idea of keeping Epstein in a private room out of the public eye. And Nicholas Negroponte pushed back, and he was like, we're not hiding Epstein. He should be out in the open. Negroponte was like, we're not going to hide Epstein. He said that Epstein should be welcome and that Nicholas Negroponte, would make absolutely no fuss about his attendance. He would welcome him 100%. In 2017, when Media Lab employees were becoming more and more uncomfortable with Epstein visiting the lab, Joy Ito wrote to them and he said, "Hey, I spoke to Nicholas Negroponte and we both agreed that you guys should be more respectful to Jeffrey Epstein. You should, quote, treat Jeffrey with respect," end quote. So now let's go back to the email that Joy Ito sent Epstein in October of 2013 as Epstein was planning a visit to the MIT campus. And apparently Epstein was trying to bring his really good friend and top-tier creep, Woody Allen, with him to MIT. And Joy Ito was feeling nervous about this, and he wrote an email on October 6th saying, quote, "I was just thinking about the two of you coming to the lab during the open house. The risk that I realize that we have is that everyone will recognize Woody and someone might take a photo of you guys. Since you two were just in the news recently, I wonder if that might be bad. The main fear that I have is that in addition to my 150 students, I have 400 random sponsors walking around during the open house, and I can't really control them that well. What do you think?" End quote. So Joy's like, yeah, somebody might see you guys. They're going to recognize Woody Allen. They're not going to recognize you. They're going to take a picture of you, and then maybe they're going to show it to somebody or post. And then somebody's going to be like, "Is that Woody Allen with esteemed sex offender Jeffrey Epstein? Oh, no." And then it's going to become big news, right? And Joy Ito doesn't want that. And this was followed by another email from Joy Ito to Epstein roughly an hour later. And that email, that subject line in that email read, "And then there was this recently, ... And in the email body, simply a link to an article about Aaron Swartz exposing a ring of PDFs at MIT's Media Lab. And remember, it was very difficult for me to track down that article. And what I really found to be surprising was that there wasn't a copy of it available in the DOJ files, the Epstein files, because you would think that they would click on it and then make a copy and enter it into the files like they did with every other link Epstein was sent. I mean, in those files, you've got random newsletters that Epstein was getting. They got everything in there. Random newsletters, that you just sign up for, and then all of a sudden you're getting financial, advice newsletters. They have everything in there, but not this email. And I found that very odd. So Joy Ito is saying, "I don't think it's a good idea to have two PDFs together on a campus because it might draw attention." And then there was this recently, and he sends the article about Aaron Swartz. Now, this article was written by Yoichi Shimatsu, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but Shimatsu was a former editor of the Japan Times Weekly, who also worked with Pacific News Service in San Francisco. In 2011, a journalism and trauma organization described him as an environmental writer who had covered the San Francisco and Kobe earthquakes and participated in rescue work after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and conducted field research in Thailand on structural failures contributing to tsunami deaths. Later, however, it appears Shimatsu became a freelance writer based in Asia, often identified as Hong Kong-based, and he wrote for outlets such as Rents and The Fourth Media. And his subjects that he was writing about and interested in increasingly kind of included things that I guess a few years ago people would call conspiracy theories, but now that so much has come out, not really. They included things like intelligence agencies, covert operations, geopolitics, elite sexual abuse networks, alleged intelligence connections, cover-ups, protections. So it does appear that this man was a legitimate journalist. He had a good reputation. He got very interested in basically being an undercover or independent investigative journalist for abuses happening to children at the hands of adults. And this seems to have been based on things he had seen throughout his life and his travels. So while he's traveling around reporting on tsunamis and human rights things, he's seeing and learning things. And some have labeled him a conspiracy theory person. But once again, based on what I've seen throughout my life and travels and our work here, I'm not going to be so quick to dismiss him. So does that mean everything he's saying is right? No. But we're going to examine the claims he makes in this article that Joy Ito sent to Jeffrey Epstein, and we're going to figure out why it had Joy Ito so jumpy and so worried, and why he was trying to use it as a reason to communicate to Epstein that Epstein and Woody Allen should not come to MIT. So I'll try to break this down into singular claims and kind of investigate from there. So claim one, Shimatsu says that Aaron Swartz was not really downloading JSTOR papers. JSTOR was a cover for a covert investigation into wrongdoing at MIT, specifically CSAM and criminal activity. Claim two, Shimatsu says that some figures at MIT and the Media Lab were allegedly producing CSAM and distributing it to wealthy and powerful sponsors and people. Claim 3, and this is where we'll dig in a bit more because it's a pretty extreme claim. Nicholas Negroponte was allegedly involved in this enterprise, and one of the ways he accomplished this was through his program, One Laptop Per Child. And this also has to do with an orphanage outside of Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Okay, this stuff gets dark. I'm not gonna, it gets dark. Let's start with what we do know and what we can prove. One Laptop Per Child was one of Nicholas Negroponte's biggest and most ambitious projects after the Media Lab, and it formally began in 2005. He said that he and Seymour Papert, a mathematician and founding member of the Media Lab, had been experimenting with children and computers since the 70s and 80s, and they hated the idea that a school would only have one computer room that, everybody in the school had to use, all the children had to use, and they'd only go there like 40 minutes a week. And Nicholas Negroponte believed that a computer should belong to a child the way a pencil belongs to a child. So you wouldn't keep all the pencils in one room where the kids only have access for a short time each week. Why would you do that with computers when computers are essential to children learning? So in a 2005 interview, Nicholas Negroponte said his eventual goal was that every child in the world would have their own laptop, even if a child didn't initially even want a laptop, which I thought that was weird. But before this program formally existed, Nicholas Negroponte became involved in a project in rural Cambodia around 2002, where children in a remote village were given laptops and internet access. And this is where it gets a little odd, because he said that this is when he figured out that kids didn't necessarily need any formal or extensive instruction to use a computer. They could teach themselves. And there was no reason to wait until you had the perfect system or until you had trained teachers or adults to show the kids how to safely use the computers, because you just got to put the tool directly into the child's hands and let them teach themselves and explore around the computer and the internet, because that sounds safe and responsible. But the laptops that Nicholas Negroponte and One Laptop Per Child created had built-in cameras, built-in microphones. They could take photos, record video, audio, support video communication.
Bringing computers to developing countries and learning pretty quickly that these kids, even though English wasn't their language, the Latin alphabet barely was their language, but they could just swim like fish. They could play these like pianos. A little bit more recently, I got involved personally, and sort of these are two anecdotes. One was in Cambodia, in a village that has no electricity, no water, no television, no telephone, but has broadband internet now. And these kids, their first English word is Google, and they only know Skype. They've never heard of telephony, okay? They just use Skype. And they go home at night. They've got a broadband connection in a hut that doesn't have electricity. The parents love it because when they open up the laptops, it's the brightest light source in the house. And talk about where metaphors and reality mix. This is the actual school. Are we providing the software? The answer is the system certainly has software, but no, we're not providing the education content. That is really done in the countries, but we are certainly constructionists, and we certainly believe in learning by doing. And
initially, there was a lot of support for this idea, and since Nicholas Negroponte already had access to world leaders and heads of government, because remember, he and his brother John come from very, very important people who are very, very involved in, the world stage, and then he's got John, his brother, who knows everybody. So the whole thing seemed promising at first, because the business model of One Laptop Per Child depended on governments buying enormous quantities of these laptops and then distributing them to school children. But then the price wasn't right, because Negroponte had initially and continually advertised it as like it's $100 laptop. If you donate $100, then you give a laptop to a child. But they can never quite get the number to $100. It was usually, I think, like between $170, $180. And certain governments did start asking valid questions like, is a laptop actually the most important thing these children need in these developing countries? Nigeria's educational minister was like, why are we giving every child a computer? Why is the government buying every child a computer when some of these schools don't even have chairs or adequate facilities? And like these villages don't have internet access or like electricity. And there was like a crane on it, which is kind of cool, actually. You like turn it and it would make electricity. I feel like, would you have to turn it for a long time? How long did it take to power up? I don't know. I have to look into that. But yeah, the education minister of Nigeria was like, our kids and our school kids need a lot more than laptops right now. And although Negroponte really believed that these children could like teach themselves, it didn't turn out to be the case. Teachers didn't understand the machines, so when children needed guidance or help, there was none. Then there would be software malfunctions, the laptops would break. There was no one to help when these things happened. So Peru actually gave one laptop per child, a pretty large-scale natural experiment. They purchased and distributed enormous numbers of the laptops in rural schools, but after 15 months, researchers found that there was no significant improvement in really anything. No significant improvement in math, language achievement, enrollment, attendance, homework, motivation. It wasn't really helping. So was this program a way to create some sort of CSAM network? Because that's the allegation. I'm not saying that. That's the allegation. I have no idea, and I have no evidence of that. However, there is plenty of evidence of what's called volunteer tourism happening in many of these same countries where these laptops were being distributed. And I'm not saying there's any other connection besides that these were disenfranchised and vulnerable locations. For example, Cambodia. The number of orphanages in Cambodia surged dramatically during the 2000s and into the 2010s, and UNICEF found that a large majority of the children in the orphanages, around 80% of the children, were not actually orphans at all and had at least one living parent, if not two. So as it turns out, what happened is recruiters from these orphanages, which were actually businesses, we'll talk about it, but recruiters from these orphanages would go into poor rural villages and persuade struggling families to hand over their children. And they were like, give us your children, we're an orphanage. Your kid will have a better life, access to food and a free education. We're going to take care of your kid because you are poor and struggling. The children would then be placed in these tourism orphanages where visiting foreigners would come to volunteer for a week or 2 weeks, make a donation, play with the kids, read them some books, and go back to their lives feeling good about themselves. This is called volunteer tourism, which, as it turns out, although well-intentioned, I suppose, very, very bad. Very bad for the people of these countries. So the children are taken away from their homes and parents. The parents are told they will be fed and cared for, but they're being used to draw in these volunteer tourists. And is the money that the tourists are giving to the orphanages going to the children? No, of course not, because it's a business. It's going in the pockets of these people who are running the orphanages. Now, it was also discovered that the children were deliberately kept underfed, kept dirty, kept living in poor conditions because this visible image of the children being hungry and dirty and sad, it elicited more donations. It elicited higher donations. So the basic model worked like this. A foreign tourist or volunteer would arrive in Cambodia, see advertisements for an orphanage or be brought to one through a hotel tour company, a church, a nonprofit, or a volunteer placement organization, and then they'd be invited to visit the children. And when you're visiting the children, you've got basically unrestricted access to them, right? The people who run these orphanages don't care. Yeah, do whatever you want with the kids. Play with them, teach them, hug them, photograph them. I don't care. Sometimes these volunteers would stay at the orphanages for days or weeks to volunteer. And in many of these facilities, once again, are we surprised that there was no safeguards for the kids, that they didn't do background checks on the people coming to stay at the orphanages and have unrestricted access to these kids every single day? Are we surprised? These are orphanages, businesses who are taking children from their families, putting them into dirty, horrible environments, starving them so that they can convince people from different countries to come there and give them money, not the orphans who aren't even really orphans, the people who are running the orphanages. Are we surprised that they didn't really care what happened to the children at that point? So these people coming to, volunteer with the orphans, they were given basically very rapid physical and emotional access to these children. And yes, that would not be great in general, but now there's a darker side to that, right? Because that same open door system that made an innocent volunteer think like, oh, how wonderful. They trust me enough to let me spend time with these kids, these poor kids. There's not enough people here to spend time with them. That's going to look very different to someone deliberately seeking children a predator who's going to arrive looking respectable, presenting himself as a volunteer, a teacher, a humanitarian, a benefactor, donating money or supplies, maybe comes with a lot of money. And the people at the orphanage, the fake orphanage, they're like, yeah, dude, go ham in there with as many kids as you want, right? We don't care what you do. We're going to take your huge check and we're going to go look the other way. That's what happened. That's what happened. That is what happened. That has happened. It has happened. It probably still is happening, honestly. But yeah, there was a big issue with this happening in Cambodia and other countries like it. I hope you understand what I mean when I say some guy comes to the orphanage with a big check and they're like, yeah, go on in. Interact with as many children as you want. We'll pretend we don't see. And that's when, the actual people in the country itself and who were running the orphanage or working at the orphanage weren't doing that exact same thing to the kids. Many occasions this happened, often, and Cambodia was already dealing with a significant problem involving traveling child sex offenders. Organizations working there have repeatedly described foreign offenders traveling into the country specifically because poverty, vulnerable children, weak systems, and historically inconsistent enforcement as far as law enforcement create opportunities for these children to be exploited. There's actually a lot out there. You can look it up yourself. I don't want to talk about it anymore. It's horrendous. It's disturbing. It's soul-crushing. I had to do a lot of research into it, and it changed me. So, and we also know that international law enforcement agencies routinely arrest individuals for possessing CSAM originating from developing nations, primarily targeting Western buyers who fund and consume this material online. Once again, this is shockingly widespread and common. You can look it up, but I can't go any deeper into it. I did go deeper. It's awful. It's disturbing. It like I said, it changes you. It's also, it's also very true and common that there's a category of sex tourism targeting children in developing nations because these predators know that many people are poverty-stricken and will sell their children when the money is waved in their faces. And in many cases, they also know that supervision of children is far more lax. Many of these children are out in the street and in public alone for a good amount of the day and night. They can be snatched, abused, and discarded, sometimes in a permanent way, killed before the traveler boards a flight back to their home country and never faces any consequences or repercussions. So you can look into all of that. It's all evidence-based. I don't need to go into specifics or talk about that, but that's what's happening in Cambodia and has happened in Cambodia. So we will come back to the orphanage claims because the author of the article says that Negroponte, as well as some other Media Lab figures, were associated with this orphanage where these things were happening. Once again, I found no evidence of that, but I found evidence that things like that do happen in orphanages there. So let's go to the Epstein files in November of 2016, when Jeffrey Epstein emailed his buddy over at Microsoft, Steven Sinofsky, asking if Steven had plans for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and Sinofsky replied back, quote, "Thanksgiving in Cambodia." End quote. Now, Steven Sinofsky takes frequent trips to Cambodia, primarily tied to his extensive philanthropic work with For a Child's Smile, a non-profit operating in Phnom Penh, dedicated to rescuing destitute, mistreated, and uneducated children, providing them with food, shelter, healthcare, and vocational training. And Steven Sinofsky is not just a distant donor. He regularly spend weeks at a time on the grounds in Cambodia. He's actively teaching classes and mentoring students in tech. Steven Sinofsky and Jeffrey Epstein had a close relationship for a long time, and he heavily relied on Epstein as a sounding board. So their relationship wasn't just, once again, business. When Steven Sinofsky left Microsoft, he turned to Epstein to help negotiate his $14 million retirement package and navigate his non-compete clause. He also shared inside information with Epstein, forwarding private internal Microsoft communications to Jeffrey Epstein. Okay, so Steven Sinofsky is in a long-term relationship with a neurosurgeon named Melanie Walker. From what I can tell, Melanie Walker and Sinofsky have been together since the early 2000s when she moved to Seattle. And as far as I can tell, they are still together. Melanie Walker has an illustrious backstory when it comes to the Epstein world. She had been mentored by Jeffrey Epstein and served as a science advisor to him in the 90s. She later became a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, Walker says she met Epstein in 1992 when she was about 23, and she was a student. He was 39. She says Donald Trump introduced them at the Plaza Hotel, and Jeffrey Epstein initially offered to help her with modeling connections. But then he encouraged her to pursue medicine and science, and by 1998, he had hired her as his science advisor. He also used his own money and connections to help advance her education and career, and public records show that Melanie Walker listed an address in the New York apartment building where Epstein controlled multiple units that he was known to house his victims in. And when I say victims, I say women that he brought from all over the place and said he was going to help them break into the modeling world, and then he housed them in these apartments. This is a pattern we have seen before with Jeffrey Epstein. And Melanie Walker's attorney has characterized her as being a survivor of a coercive relationship with Epstein. So in 2014, Melanie Walker emailed Bill Gates, and she advised him to maintain a healthy distance from Epstein. According to the reporting, Melanie Walker told Bill Gates that she'd seen Epstein cause problems for powerful people before, and she described him as someone who appealed to people's weaknesses and proclivities. And yet, Melanie Walker remained close to Jeffrey Epstein herself. Because in 2017, Melanie was texting Epstein about her relationship with Bill Gates, which apparently had turned sexual. And it looks like her relationship with Bill Gates turned sexual because Jeffrey Epstein told her to make it turn sexual. Okay? This is crazy. Jeffrey Epstein told Melanie Walker, quote, "With BG, all you would have to do is say, 'You should know that I've told Jeffrey everything, end quote. Melanie Walker replied that she was worried Bill Gates would immediately retaliate against her. In fact, in the months prior, Epstein had coached Melanie on how to flirt with Bill Gates, how to get him, alone and do things with him, even telling her what words she should write in notes to Bill Gates to really get him under her spell. There were also references to a blue dress, a blue dress reference. When I say a blue dress reference, I don't mean an actual blue dress. I mean Monica Lewinsky's blue dress. So Melanie Walker told Epstein, quote, "Yes, I have blue dress emails and a few other embarrassing things. And yes, the stories are so eerily similar to all in media that he sounds Weinstein-like. I can't be the only one," end quote. Weinstein-like. That's what Melanie Walker is saying about Bill Gates. She's saying I have blue dress emails, meaning I have emails that would condemn Bill Gates and show the world that he's having this kind of illicit sexual affair with me. And she even talks about how Melinda is up her ass, and it's oh, I think Melinda Gates knows. She's all over me. Am I saying that Steven Sinofsky was up to something in Cambodia? Something that maybe his charity was a shield for? No, of course I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I don't have evidence of that. I'm saying that anyone who has this close of a relationship to Jeffrey Epstein and a close relationship with a coerced victim of Epstein's who was apparently pimped out to Bill Gates in order to get his secrets and obtain blackmail information about him to be used by Jeffrey Epstein probably has some secrets of his own. What I'm saying is, let me be clear, Melanie Walker is told by Jeffrey Epstein, get in bed with Bill Gates so that I can have blackmail, and figure out stuff behind the scenes about what's going on with Bill Gates so I can have blackmail and I can have power over Bill Gates. And we know, in fact, that Bill Gates himself has said Jeffrey Epstein tried to blackmail him with certain affairs. And now Melanie then also kind of jumps into bed with Steven Sinofsky, also who was Microsoft affiliated. Did Jeffrey Epstein tell Melanie to get in a relationship with Steven Sinofsky? And if he did, then that means Steven Sinofsky has stuff that Jeffrey Epstein wanted to know that would ruin him. Maybe that is exactly how Melanie Walker ended up being in a close and intimate relationship with Steven Sinofsky because she was instructed to be. There's a lot of talk about Cambodia and Epstein's emails, and a few of these conversations are interesting and contextual to me, and in my opinion, show an underlying current of illegal activity that spans the board. So that is where we're going to pick up next time. And we're also going to explore the further allegations against MIT and some of the figures at the Media Lab, which were laid out in this article that Joy Ito felt compelled to send Jeffrey Epstein, as Jeffrey Epstein, Woody Allen were planning a trip to MIT. Oh, there's also an interesting thing that MIT was doing. They were exploring the idea of creating child robots to hopefully be able to provide to PDFs, men who had certain proclivities, so that the proclivities would be taken out on the child robots and not on actual children. Very interesting. So stay tuned for that. I know we talked about a lot today, and I know this video is long. Maybe some of it was confusing, but let me know if you have any questions. Tell me what you think about this video and this whole unfolding thing in the comment section. And if you like this video, like it. If you think it's worth sharing, please share it. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we're going to keep going. We're going to keep unraveling. I mean, at this point, I don't see how we can stop. So thank you so much for being here. Until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe. And I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.
Well, the levee don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're going back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood